If you're enjoying this deep dive into history's darkest corners, please hit those hype points. It helps this channel more than you possibly know. And drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing our community spread across the globe. Now, before we begin, a huge thank you to Jessica for suggesting this topic. Jessica, this one's for you. What if I told you that one of the most beloved toys of the 1980s had roots in one of America's most disturbing social experiments? What if those innocent dolls with their soft faces and adoption certificates weren't just clever marketing, but echoes of something far more sinister? Tonight, we're investigating a conspiracy that connects orphaned children, secret government programs, and a legacy of erased identities that stretches back over a century. This is the story of the children who vanished. The farmhouse had been abandoned for 30 years. Lydia Crane knew this because she'd read the property records 3 times before accepting the job. The Historical Preservation Society needed someone to document anything worth saving before the demolition crew arrived, and Lydia, with her background in archival work and her obsessive attention to detail, seemed like the perfect choice. She wasn't prepared for what she would find. The house sat at the end of a dirt road in upstate New York, about 40 minutes outside of Albany. October wind stripped the last leaves from the maple trees surrounding the property, and the whole place had that particular silence that comes with true isolation. Lydia pulled her jacket tighter as she approached the front porch, noting the way the wood had warped and split over decades of neglect. Inside, dust particles floated through shafts of afternoon light. The furniture remained exactly as the last owners had left it, a table still set with plates, photographs still hanging on walls, a life interrupted and never resumed. Lydia methodically worked through the first floor, cataloguing, photographing, making notes. Nothing remarkable, nothing unusual. The attic was different. She'd almost skipped it entirely. The pull-down ladder looked unsafe, the hinges rusted, but something made her test her weight on the first rung. It held. She climbed into darkness, clicking on her flashlight. The attic stretched the full length of the house, filled with the typical detritus of forgotten lives. Boxes of clothes, broken furniture, stacks of magazines from the 1950s. But in the far corner, beneath a water-stained tarp, Lydia found the trunk. It was old, genuinely old, with brass fixtures turned green with age and a lock that had rusted shut. She had to use a crowbar to break it open, the metal screeching in protest. When the lid finally gave way, Lydia found herself staring at something impossible. Dolls. Dozens of them, packed carefully in layers of yellow tissue paper. But these weren't ordinary dolls. Each one had been hand-stitched from fabric with carefully embroidered features and soft bodies stuffed with what felt like sawdust or straw. They looked remarkably similar to Cabbage Patch Kids. That same round face, those same simple features, but the fabric was old, genuinely antique, and the stitching showed the kind of painstaking handiwork that predated mass production by decades. Lydia lifted one carefully. The fabric felt fragile, ready to disintegrate. She turned it over and found a name sewn into the lining with black thread. Emma Rothschild, age 4. Her hand started shaking. She pulled out another doll. Thomas McCarthy, age 7. Another. Ruth Silverman, age 5. Every single doll had a name and age sewn inside. Every single one was a child. Beneath the dolls, Lydia found the photographs. Faded silver nitrate prints, the kind used in the late 1800s. The images showed children, dozens of them, arranged in formal poses, their faces solemn, their clothes plain, and their features. Lydia held up one of the dolls next to a photograph. The resemblance was unmistakable. Someone had created these dolls to look exactly like real children. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, she found the ledger. The cover was leather, cracked and dry with age. Gold lettering, nearly worn away, read, Children's Aid Society, Special Transfer Manifest 1887. Lydia opened it with trembling fingers. Pages and pages of entries. Names, ages, dates, destinations. But what made her stomach turn were the notations in the margins, serial numbers, physical descriptions, and next to many entries a single phrase, Isaac Project, Phase 2. She was about to close the ledger when something fell from the spine. A slip of paper, folded many times, the ink faded but still legible. It read, "They were never meant to be found." Lydia sat back on her heels, surrounded by dolls and photographs and the accumulated dust of a century. She'd come here expecting to catalogue old furniture and maybe some interesting antiques. Instead, she'd stumbled onto something that felt like a crime scene. She pulled out her phone. No signal in the attic. Of course not. Lydia carefully repacked everything into the trunk, photographing each item as she went. Whatever this was, whatever she'd found, it needed to be preserved. It needed to be investigated. It needed to be understood. As she climbed down from the attic, the trunk heavy in her arms, Lydia Crane had no idea that she'd just opened a door into one of America's darkest secrets. She had no idea that the children in those photographs had been part of something so disturbing that even a century later, someone wanted it to stay buried. But she was about to find out. Part 2. The First Clue. Lydia couldn't go back to the farmhouse. Not immediately. The demolition had been postponed due to permitting issues, something about asbestos, abatement, which meant the building would stand for at least another month. But she couldn't stop thinking about that attic, about what else might be hidden there. She'd taken the trunk, yes, but what if there was more? 3 days after her initial discovery, Lydia returned. This time she brought proper equipment, high-powered flashlights, a crowbar, work gloves, and a genuine curiosity that bordered on obsession. The attic looked different in the late afternoon light. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, and the settling house creaked in ways that made her jump. She'd already cleared out the trunk, but now she moved methodically through the rest of the space, checking every box, every corner, every place where something might be hidden. Behind a section of exposed insulation, her flashlight caught something. Scratches in the wooden beam. Not random marks, deliberate scratches, carved with something sharp. She brushed away decades of dust and read the words, "Forgive me for what I kept. Forgive me for what I knew." M.H. 1956, 1956. The same year records had disappeared from university archives. The same year files had been destroyed in that convenient fire. M.E.H. Had this person hidden the trunk? Or had they lived here, carrying the burden of what they knew? Lydia photographed the inscription, her hands shaking slightly. This wasn't just an academic mystery anymore. Someone had lived with this secret, had felt guilty enough to apologise to whoever might find it. She was about to leave when she noticed the loose floorboard. It was subtle. Just a slight gap between planks that didn't quite match the others. She pried it up carefully. Inside the hollow space beneath, a smaller box, metal, about the size of a shoebox. When she opened it, the smell of old paper and mildew hit her immediately. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in careful script on yellowed stationery. She picked up the first one, dated July 12th, 1890. "Dear Patron," it began, "I write to update you on Subject 15's progress. The child has adapted well to the rural environment and shows none of the moral deficiencies predicted by her urban origins. Her adoptive family reports excellent behaviour and quick learning. The monthly measurements are enclosed. We continue observation as planned." It was signed with initials, H.F., Henry Falk. Lydia sat back on her heels, the letter trembling in her hands. These were the actual reports. The documentation of the experiment, written in real time by the person conducting it. She read another letter, this one from October 3rd, 1892. "Patron, I regret to inform you that Subject 29 has been lost. The family reports the child fell ill with fever and expired on September 20th. This represents our third loss this year and raises concerns about the robustness of subjects selected from diseased populations. I have adjusted selection criteria. Accordingly, lost, expired, not died or passed away. Clinical language for a child's death. Lydia's stomach turned. She wanted to stop reading, but she couldn't. She had to know. Another letter, dated March 18th, 1895. The preliminary results are promising. Subjects placed in controlled environments show marked improvement over their probable outcomes had they remained in urban poverty. Of the original 42, 34 survived to adolescence, a success rate of 81%, well above typical orphan survival rates. The benefactors should be pleased with their investment. Investment. These were children, and he was calling them an investment. The last letter in the box was different. The handwriting was shakier, the tone less confident. It was dated November the 7th, 1903. I have come to doubt the ethics of our endeavour. The children were never asked, never given choice. We told ourselves we were saving them, giving them better lives, but we were using them. I see that now. I have kept records of everything. Perhaps someday someone will judge whether we were visionaries or monsters. I fear I already know the answer. Even Falk himself had eventually questioned what he'd done, but not until after 15 years of experimentation, not until after children had died, not until it was far too late to undo the damage. Lydia packed the letters carefully into her bag. Combined with the trunk, she now had overwhelming evidence of what the Isaac Project had been. Not speculation, not theory, hard proof, written by the person who'd conducted the experiments. As she climbed down from the attic for the last time, Lydia made a decision. This story needed to be told, not just published in an academic journal where a few specialists would read it. This needed to reach people. It needed to matter. She had no idea how much resistance she was about to face. Part 3. The Orphan Trains. Lydia spent the next week obsessively researching the Children's Aid Society. What she found was a story that most Americans had never heard, despite it being one of the largest social experiments in the nation's history. The orphan train movement began in 1854, the brainchild of a man named Charles Loring Brace. A minister and social reformer, Brace was genuinely disturbed by the thousands of homeless children living on the streets of New York City. These were children whose parents had died in epidemics, or who'd been abandoned during economic downturns, or who'd simply gotten lost in the chaos of rapid urbanization. Brace's solution was radical for its time. Relocate these children to rural families in the Midwest and West, where they could be saved from the corrupting influence of city life and put to work on farms. He called it placing out, and he genuinely believed he was saving lives. The first orphan train left New York City on September 26, 1854, carrying 46 children. Over the next 75 years, until the last train ran in 1929, more than 200,000 children would be relocated through this program. But as Lydia dug deeper, she began to see the cracks in the fairy tale. Many of these children weren't orphans at all. They were half-orphans with one living parent, or children whose families were simply too poor to care for them, or immigrant children whose parents had been deemed unfit by social workers. The Children's Aid Society often took these children without proper consent, loading them onto trains with little more than the clothes on their backs. Once on the trains, the children were taken to small towns throughout the Midwest. They'd be lined up on train platforms or in churches, and local families would look them over like livestock at an auction. Brothers and sisters were often separated. Older children were frequently chosen for their labour value rather than any genuine desire to provide a home, and once a child was placed, there was virtually no follow-up, no oversight, no way to ensure they were being treated well. Many children were loved and cared for by their new families, but many others became little more than indentured servants, working brutal hours with no pay and no prospects, and many others simply disappeared. That was what disturbed Lydia most. The records were incomplete, deliberately so. Children would be listed as placed with a family, but there would be no surnames, no addresses, no way to track what happened to them. It was as if they'd been erased from history. And then there were the special transfer manifests. Lydia found references to them in several historical databases, but the actual documents were missing. Footnotes in academic papers mentioned them. Catalogue entries in archival collections reference them. But the files themselves? Gone, lost, destroyed. The explanations varied, but the result was always the same. Whatever these special transfers involved, someone had worked very hard to erase the evidence. The ledger from the attic was different. It was an original document, and it detailed something that wasn't supposed to exist. Lydia spread the pages out on her dining room table, comparing the entries to what little she could find in public records. The children listed in the manifest didn't appear in any of the official adoption records she could access. Their names were absent from census data. They seemed to have vanished completely after being placed on those special trains. But they hadn't vanished without a trace. Someone had made dolls of their faces. Someone had photographed them. Someone had kept meticulous records of their serial numbers and physical characteristics. Someone had been studying them. Part 3. The Cabbage Patch Connection. The connection came to Lydia at 2 a.m, when she was too wired to sleep and scrolling through images of the dolls she'd found. Cabbage Patch. Kids. The resemblance was too close to be coincidental. Those same soft features, that same innocent aesthetic, even the concept of adoption certificates. It all echoed what she'd found in that attic trunk. But Cabbage Patch Kids had been created in 1983 by a man named Xavier Roberts. What could possibly connect his creative work to dolls made a century earlier? Lydia started researching Roberts's background. He'd grown up in Georgia, in the Appalachian region, and had learned the technique of needle moulding from a folk artist named Martha Nelson Thomas. The dolls, originally called Little People, were handcrafted using techniques that Roberts claimed were inspired by traditional Appalachian craft work. But when Lydia started tracing Roberts's family genealogy, she found something that made her hands shake. A distant relative, a great-great-uncle on his mother's side, appeared in the Children's Aid Society records from 1887, not as a child, but as an associate. His name was listed among the private donors who funded special programs, and his name appeared 3 times in the ledger from the trunk, always with the notation, Isaac Project, Authorized Observer. It could be coincidence. Family trees are complicated, and just because one relative was involved didn't mean there was any direct connection to Xavier Roberts over a century later. But Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at work. She turned her attention to the phrase that kept appearing in her research: cabbage children. The idea that babies came from cabbage patches was genuine 19th century folklore, particularly common in rural areas of Georgia, Appalachia and upstate New York. It was the kind of innocent lie adults told children who asked uncomfortable questions about where babies came from. But Lydia found references suggesting it had been used by some orphan train agents as a kind of code. In a memoir written in 1932 by a former Children's Aid Society worker, now out of print and available only in university special collections, Lydia found a disturbing passage. We sometimes referred to certain children as cabbage children, meaning those whose origins were unknown, or whose backgrounds made them unsuitable for standard placement. These children required special handling and were often sent to families willing to participate in experimental arrangements. Experimental arrangements. Lydia felt sick reading those words. What kind of experiments? What kind of special handling? And why did cabbage children need different treatment than other orphans? She pulled out the photographs again, studying the faces of the children. They all looked healthy, well-fed, clean. These weren't street urchins or neglected waifs. They looked like they'd been carefully selected for something. The dolls took on a new meaning in this context. They weren't toys, they were records, maps, each one a physical representation of a child's features preserved with painstaking accuracy. In an era before reliable photography was widespread, before systematic record-keeping, someone had created these dolls as a way to document exactly what these children looked like. But why? Part 4. The Isaac Project. The name Isaac Project appeared 37 times in the ledger from the trunk, but when Lydia searched historical databases, academic papers and archives, she found nothing. No government program by that name, no charitable foundation, no research initiative. It was as if the project had never existed. But it had existed. She had the proof in her hands. Lydia turned to the historical context, trying to understand what was happening in 1887 that might explain this mysterious project. What she found was disturbing. The late 1880s were a turning point in American social science. The wealthy elite, families like the Carnegies and Rockefellers, had begun funding research into heredity, behaviour, and what they called social betterment. This was before genetics was understood, before modern psychology existed. Researchers were operating with primitive theories about inherited traits, using crude methods like phrenology, measuring skull shapes to predict intelligence and character. There was also growing interest in the question of nature versus nurture. Could environment overcome bad heredity? Could good breeding be improved through proper rearing? These questions weren't just academic, they had profound implications for how society dealt with the poor, immigrants, and other marginalised groups. And orphans were the perfect test subjects. They had no families to object to their treatment. They had no legal protections. They could be moved around, placed in controlled environments, and observed over years without anyone questioning what was being done to them. If you wanted to conduct long-term studies on human development, homeless children were an ideal population. Lydia found records showing that in 1887 several New York hospitals and universities were conducting research into child psychology and development. The work was crude by modern standards, more observation than actual science, but it was taken seriously by the philanthropic organisations funding it. One name kept appearing in her research: Henry Falk. Officially, Falk was a physician and a researcher associated with several institutions in New York during the 1880s. He published papers on child development, heredity, and what he called environmental conditioning. He advocated for what he termed controlled rural rearing of orphaned children, arguing that removing them from urban environments could improve their moral and physical development. But Falk's official publications were dry, academic, unremarkable. It was what Lydia found in private correspondence that changed everything. A letter from Falk to a colleague, dated March 15, 1888, preserved in a university archive. The Cabbage line children are progressing as expected. The isolation of their placements has proven ideal for observation without interference. We have successfully established baseline measurements for 42 subjects and will continue tracking through adolescence. The funding from our benefactors remains secure, provided we maintain absolute discretion. The Cabbage line, 42 subjects, absolute discretion. Lydia cross-referenced that number with her ledger. 42 children had been sent out on a special transport on November the 4th, 1889, 2 days after the date of Falk's letter. Official Children's Aid Society records showed 64 children on that train, but only 22 were documented as adopted through normal channels. 42 children had disappeared into the Isaac Project. Part 5. The photographs. Lydia went back to the trunk. She'd been so focused on the ledger that she hadn't fully examined all the photographs. Now she spread them across her living room floor, organising them by date and identifying marks. Most showed groups of children in formal poses, the kind of photographs taken to document the orphan trains before departure. But tucked into the bottom of the stack was something different. A larger photograph, professionally mounted, with a typed label on the back. Test Group 3, 1889. The image showed children arranged in 3 precise rows like a school photograph. But these children weren't smiling. They stared at the camera with expressions that were eerily uniform. Calm, blank, almost serene, and each child wore a numbered tag pinned to their clothing. Lydia pulled out a magnifying glass. The numbers were visible in the photograph and she began comparing them to the entries in the ledger. Number 7 corresponded to Emma Rothschild. Number 12 was Thomas McCarthy. Number 23 was Ruth Silverman. Every numbered child in the photograph matched an entry in the Isaac Project manifest, and every child had a corresponding doll in the trunk. Lydia felt her skin crawl. This wasn't just record-keeping. This was systematic documentation of human subjects. These children had been catalogued, numbered, studied like laboratory specimens, and someone had created dolls to preserve their exact features, a physical record that could last far longer than photographs. She examined the dolls again with new eyes. The stitching wasn't just skilled, it was precise. The facial features had been rendered with painstaking accuracy, capturing not just general appearance but specific details. The exact shape of a nose, the particular curve of a cheek, the precise spacing of eyes. Whoever made these dolls had spent hours studying each child's face. In the age before reliable photography was widespread, before photocopying or digital records, these dolls would have been the most accurate way to preserve what someone looked like. They were three-dimensional maps of human faces, but why create them at all? Why was it so important to preserve these children's exact appearances? The answer came to Lydia slowly, sickeningly. If you were conducting a long-term study of human development, you'd want to track changes over time. You'd want to be able to compare how subjects looked as children versus how they appeared as adolescents or adults. You'd want a baseline, a permanent record of their starting point. These dolls were baselines. They were the control samples in a massive human experiment. Part 6. The cover-up. Lydia decided it was time to go public with her findings, but first she needed to verify everything she'd discovered. She needed access to the original Children's Aid Society records, the ones that should have documented these special transfers. She started with the National Archives in Washington. She took the train down, bringing copies of her ledger and some of the less fragile letters. She had an appointment scheduled with the head archivist of the social welfare collections. The building was imposing, all marble and authority. Lydia felt small walking through the massive doors, but she reminded herself why she was here. For Emma Rothschild, for Thomas McCarthy, for the 42 children who deserved to have their story told. The archivist, a woman named Patricia Odenkirk, met her in a sterile research room. She was probably in her early 60s, with severe grey hair pulled back and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "Miss Crane," she said, shaking Lydia's hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm, "I understand you're researching the orphan train movement. Specifically, I'm looking for records related to special placement programs operated by the Children's Aid Society between 1885 and 1895, Lydia said, pulling out her documentation. I have reason to believe there were experimental programs that aren't well documented in the existing literature. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. What kind of experimental programs? Long-term observational studies of child development, placements made specifically for research purposes rather than humanitarian ones. Lydia laid out the ledger photocopies. I found this manifest in a private collection. It references something called the Isaac Project and lists transfers that don't appear in any public records. Patricia examined the documents, her face carefully neutral. Where did you say you found these? A private estate. The papers had been preserved in storage for over a century. I see. Patricia set down the papers. Miss Crane, the Children's Aid Society records we have here are quite extensive. If there was a program by this name, it would be documented. That's what I'm hoping to verify. I'd like to request access to the special transfer, manifests from November 1889, and any correspondence or internal memos that mention research programs or... Those files are restricted. Lydia blinked. I'm sorry. The files you're requesting are marked as restricted access. Patricia's tone was professional, almost rehearsed. They require departmental approval before they can be viewed. Which department? That's not specified in our system. Then how do I get approval? Patricia stood, gathering the photocopies. I'll need to make some inquiries. This will take time, Miss Crane, perhaps several weeks. I can wait. I'll stay in Washington if I need to. That won't be necessary. I have your contact information. We'll reach out when we have clarity on the access requirements. Lydia felt herself being dismissed. Miss Odenkirk, these are historical records. They're over a century old. What possible reason could there be for restricting access? Privacy concerns, most likely. The Children's Aid Society dealt with minors, and even historical records can contain sensitive personal information. The children in these records are dead. Their children are probably dead. We're talking about events from 1887. Patricia's expression hardened slightly. Nevertheless, the restrictions exist. I don't make these rules, Miss Crane. I simply enforce them. Can you at least tell me who placed the restrictions? When were they implemented? That information isn't readily available, but it exists. A pause. I would need to research it. Then please do, because what I've found suggests that children were used as experimental subjects without consent, and someone has been working very hard to keep that information buried. Lydia stood, matching Patricia's height. Those children deserve to have their story told, and I'm going to tell it, with or without access to these files. Patricia's face was unreadable. I'll make my inquiries. Good day, Miss Crane. Lydia left the National Archives feeling both frustrated and energised. The resistance she'd encountered only confirmed her suspicions. If there was nothing to hide, why restrict access to century-old documents? She tried university archives next. Columbia first, since Falk had been affiliated with them during the crucial years. The Special Collections librarian at Columbia was more helpful, or at least seemed to want to be. His name was James Chen, a graduate student working part-time while finishing his doctorate. Falk's employment record should be in the administrative archives, James said, pulling up the catalogue on his computer. Let me see what we have. He clicked through several screens, his expression growing confused. That's odd. What? The catalogue shows entries for 1881 through 1884, then picks up again in 1891. But the years in between, they're listed as materials destroyed, fire of 1956. I know, Lydia said. But surely there would be duplicates, copies of employment contracts, payroll records, anything. James kept clicking. There should be. Personnel files were typically kept in multiple locations, but it looks like everything from that period is gone. Not just Falk's records, a whole range of faculty files from 1885 to 1890. Just those years? Yeah. And that's suspicious because the fire in 1956 was limited to one building. It shouldn't have affected multiple archive locations. Lydia leaned forward. So what you're saying is, someone purged these records deliberately, made it look like fire damage, but actually went through and removed specific years from multiple collections. James looked at her with genuine interest. What are you researching that's got someone this worried? Lydia made a decision. She trusted this kid. He had the right instincts, and he clearly wasn't part of whatever cover-up had happened in the 50s. She told him everything. When she finished, James sat back in his chair, his eyes wide. Holy hell! That's huge! That's unethical human experimentation on children. That's a massive story. I know, but I need more proof. I need to find out who scrubbed these records and why. Give me a few days, James said. I know some people in other departments. If there's anything left, any trace of what happened in 56, I'll find it. 3 days later, James called her. You need to come back to Columbia. I found something. Part 7. The connection deepens. Lydia's research took a darker turn when she started investigating the broader context of social research in the late 1800s. The American eugenics movement officially began in 1904 with the establishment of the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, New York. But its roots went back further, back to the heredity studies and racial theories of the 1880s and 90s. Researchers during that period were obsessed with the idea that social problems, poverty, crime, mental illness, were inherited traits that could be bred out of the population through selective reproduction. They believed that inferior stock could be improved through careful management, or that superior genetics could be identified and promoted. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was supported by major universities, funded by wealthy philanthropists, and endorsed by prominent scientists. It was the mainstream consensus among educated elites, and orphans were central to this research. If heredity determined character and ability, then studying orphan children could reveal whether environment could overcome bad breeding. If you took children from inferior stock, poor immigrants, criminals, the morally degenerate, and raised them in controlled environments, would they turn out better than their parents? Or would their bad blood win out? The Isaac Project, Lydia realised, might have been an early attempt to answer these questions. Take children with unknown or problematic backgrounds, Place them with isolated rural families willing to raise them according to specific guidelines. Monitor them over years or decades. Compare their development to baseline measurements. Record everything. It would be a massive long-term study of nature versus nurture, conducted on human subjects who had no ability to consent and no protection under law. And it would require absolute secrecy, because even in the 1880s, there would have been public outcry if people knew children were being used as laboratory specimens. Lydia found hints of this in the historical record. References to special placement programs in Children's Aid Society annual reports. Vague mentions of observational research in philanthropic foundations' grant records. Acknowledgements in academic papers thanking unnamed benefactors for funding longitudinal studies of child development. But nothing concrete, nothing explicit. Just shadows and suggestions, carefully crafted to be plausibly deniable. The only hard evidence was the trunk she'd found. The dolls, the photographs, the ledger. Evidence that someone had tried very hard to destroy. Part 8. The survivors. Lydia decided to approach the problem from a different angle. If 42 children had been placed through the Isaac Project, and if some of them had survived to adulthood, there might be descendants. People who'd grown up hearing family stories about mysterious origins, adoptions that didn't quite make sense, relatives who appeared out of nowhere in the 1880s with no explanation. She put out calls on genealogy forums and historical society message boards, carefully wording her requests to avoid sounding like a conspiracy theorist. She was researching the orphan train movement, she explained, looking for families whose ancestors might have been placed through special programs, interested in unusual adoption stories from the late 1800s. The responses started slowly, then picked up momentum. A woman in Kansas whose great-grandmother had been brought to the state as a child in 1888, placed with a farming family despite having no orphan train documentation. A man in Nebraska whose ancestor appeared in the 1890 census with an approximate age and no birth record, living with a family who claimed to have adopted him from the East, but could provide no paperwork. A woman in Iowa who'd been researching her family tree and found a gap. A child who arrived in 1889 with one name but was buried 70 years later under a completely different identity. The stories were remarkably similar. Children appearing with minimal documentation, families who were tight-lipped about the circumstances, origins that didn't quite add up, and in several cases, odd details about the families who took these children in. They were unusually isolated, often childless, sometimes people with backgrounds in education or medicine. Exactly the kind of families you'd choose if you wanted controlled environments for long-term observation. Lydia cross-referenced the names and locations with her ledger. Not all of them matched. Some of the stories were probably just normal orphan train placements, the kind of routine adoptions that happened thousands of times. But several lined up perfectly. Emma Rothschild, listed in the ledger as placed with a family in rural Kansas in 1888, matched the great-grandmother of the woman who'd contacted Lydia. The locations, dates and ages all corresponded. Lydia reached out to the woman, asking if she'd ever heard any unusual stories about her great-grandmother's adoption. The response came 2 days later. Funny you should ask. My grandmother, Emma's daughter, used to tell me that her mother never talked about her childhood, except to say she'd been chosen for something special. She had a strange doll that she kept until she died, a handmade thing that supposedly looked just like her as a child. She told my grandmother that they had given it to her before she left New York so she'd never forget what she looked like. I always thought it was a weird thing to say. Why would you need a doll to remember your own face? Lydia felt chills reading those words. The families hadn't just received the children, they'd received the dolls too. Each child was sent with a physical record of their appearance, a baseline for comparison as they grew. It was more confirmation of what Lydia already suspected. The Isaac Project had been a systematic, long-term study of human development, and it had continued far longer than just the initial placement. Part 9. The Second Generation. The breakthrough came when Lydia found the second photograph. She'd been so focused on the image of the children that she'd overlooked another photo tucked into the ledger's back cover. It showed a group of adults, men and women in early 20th century clothing, standing in front of a building Lydia didn't recognise. The photo was dated on the back. Isaac Project Alumni, 1917. Alumni. Lydia studied the faces carefully. These were people in their 30s or 40s, well-dressed, professional-looking. They stood in formal poses, several holding objects that Lydia couldn't quite make out in the faded image. She scanned the photo at high resolution and zoomed in. One of the women held a doll, one of the dolls from the trunk, or one very similar, and the man next to her held what looked like a leather-bound ledger. Lydia's breath caught. She pulled out the photograph of Test Group 3, the children from 1889. She compared faces, looking for similarities, and there it was. A child in the front row of the 1889 photo, a girl marked with the number 15, had a distinctive birthmark on her left cheek, visible even in the faded silver nitrate print. And one of the women in the 1917 photo had the same mark, in the same location, aged 30 years. Number 15 from the Isaac Project was standing among the alumni in 1917, holding a doll that looked exactly like her childhood self. The implications made Lydia's head spin. The project hadn't ended when the children were placed. It had continued throughout their lives. They'd been monitored, tracked, studied from childhood through adulthood, and at least some of them had been brought back into the program, not as subjects, but as participants, as researchers themselves. It was generational. The children who'd been studied had become the ones doing the studying. Lydia looked again at the caption. Continuing the work. What work? What had they been trained to do? And more disturbing, were they victims who'd been indoctrinated into perpetuating their own abuse? Or had some of them genuinely believed they were part of something important, something that justified what had been done to them? She thought about the eugenics movement, how it had grown from fringe theory in the 1880s to mainstream science by the early 1900s, how it had influenced policy, shaped laws, led to forced sterilisation programs that wouldn't be fully dismantled until the 1970s. What if the Isaac Project hadn't just studied children? What if it had created believers, people raised from childhood to accept eugenic theories as truth, to see themselves as data points in a grand experiment, to carry that ideology forward into the next generation? The scariest part was how successful it might have been. Many of the adults in the 1917 photo looked prosperous, educated, respectable. If the goal had been to prove that children from inferior backgrounds could be improved through controlled rearing and careful monitoring, these alumni might have been presented as evidence of success. Look, the researchers could say, we took street children and orphans and turned them into productive citizens. Our methods work. Never mind the loss of identity. Never mind the lack of consent. Never mind the children who didn't make it, who broke under the pressure, who disappeared from the records without explanation. The ones who survived could be held up as proof that the experiment was worth it. Part 9. The Eugenics Connection. Back in her apartment, surrounded by photographs and documents that James had helped her copy from the secret archive, Lydia began piecing together the larger picture. The Isaac Project wasn't an isolated experiment. It was part of a much broader movement. The American eugenics movement officially began in 1904, with the establishment of the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, New York. But its roots went back further, back to the heredity studies and racial theories of the 1880s and 90s. Researchers during that period were obsessed with the idea that social problems, poverty, crime, mental illness, were inherited traits that could be bred out of the population through selective reproduction. They believed that inferior stock could be improved through careful management, or that superior genetics could be identified and promoted. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was supported by major universities, funded by wealthy philanthropists, and endorsed by prominent scientists. It was the mainstream consensus among educated elites, and orphans were central to this research. If heredity determined character and ability, then studying orphan children could reveal whether environment could overcome bad breeding. If you took children from inferior stock, poor immigrants, criminals, the morally degenerate, and raised them in controlled environments, would they turn out better than their parents? Or would their bad blood win out? The Isaac Project, Lydia realised, might have been an early attempt to answer these questions, a prototype for the larger eugenics programs that would follow. Take children with unknown or problematic backgrounds, place them with isolated rural families willing to raise them according to specific guidelines, monitor them over years or decades, compare their development to baseline measurements, record everything. It would be a massive long-term study of nature versus nurture, conducted on human subjects who had no ability to consent and no protection under law. And it would require absolute secrecy, because even in the 1880s there would have been public outcry if people knew children were being used as laboratory specimens. But Lydia found something in Falk's notes that made her stomach turn. A passage dated September 3rd, 1891. Subject 7's failure to thrive raises difficult questions. The child came from documented criminal lineage, father imprisoned for theft, mother a known prostitute. Despite optimal placement conditions and 3 years of intervention, the subject demonstrates persistent moral deficiency, including theft and aggressive behaviour. This suggests that hereditary taint cannot always be overcome by environmental advantage. Recommendation: discontinue observation and remove subject from program. Remove subject from program? What did that mean? Where did subject 7 go? Lydia cross-referenced the number. Subject 7 was Emma Rothschild, the child whose descendant had contacted her about the strange doll. But according to Emma's family history, she'd lived a full life, had children, grandchildren. She hadn't been removed. So what did Falk mean? Unless... Lydia felt sick. Unless Falk had initially recommended removal, but someone had overruled him. Or unless Emma had been one of the lucky ones, and other children hadn't been. She found another note, dated November 12th, 1893. The death of subject, 29 from typhoid fever, while regrettable, provides an opportunity to examine hereditary influence on disease susceptibility. The subject's mother died of consumption, suggesting constitutional weakness. Tissue samples have been preserved for future study. They'd harvested tissue samples from a dead child's body for research. Lydia had to put down the notebook. She walked to her kitchen, poured herself a glass of water with shaking hands. These weren't just unethical experiments. This was systematic dehumanization. These children weren't people to Falk and his colleagues. They were specimens. And yet the Isaac Project alumni photo showed some of those children had grown up, had joined the program as researchers. How? Why would anyone willingly participate in perpetuating what had been done to them? She thought about Stockholm Syndrome, about indoctrination, about how children raised in a certain belief system often internalized it as truth, even when it was harmful. If you'd been told from age 5 that you were part of an important scientific study, that your suffering had purpose, that you were contributing to human knowledge, would you believe it? Especially if the alternative was to face the reality that you'd been abused, exploited, used. Maybe some of the alumni had convinced themselves that the project was noble. Maybe they'd rewritten their own histories to make their trauma meaningful. Or maybe, and this was almost worse, they'd genuinely been selected for certain traits. Maybe Falk had chosen children who showed high intelligence or compliance or adaptability. Maybe he'd shaped them deliberately, groomed them to become the next generation of researchers. It would be the ultimate proof of his theories. Take children from the gutter, apply environmental conditioning, and produce scientists. Nature overcome by nurture. The experiment that proves itself. Lydia found connections between the Isaac Project alumni and later eugenics organisations. Ruth Silverman appeared as a co-author on papers published by the Eugenics Record Office in the 19-teens. Emma Rothschild's name appeared in funding acknowledgements for heredity studies at the Carnegie Institution. Daniel Weiss had become a prominent advocate for immigration restrictions based on racial theories. The children who'd been subjected to eugenic experimentation had grown up to become eugenicists themselves, and their work had influenced policy. Immigration laws in the 1920s, forced sterilization programs that affected tens of thousands of people, scientific racism that provided intellectual cover for segregation and discrimination. The Isaac Project's legacy wasn't just the 42 children who'd been directly involved. It was the ideology they'd helped spread, the research they'd conducted, the policies they'd influenced. How many lives had been affected by what started in that trunk? How far did the damage reach? Part 10. The Modern Connection. Lydia spent weeks trying to trace what happened to the Isaac Project after 1917. The trail went cold in the 1920s, around the same time the orphan train movement was winding down. Public attitudes were changing. Child welfare laws were being strengthened. The kind of loose oversight that had allowed programs like Isaac to exist was becoming harder to maintain. But the ideology didn't disappear, it just went underground. Lydia found connections between some of the people in the 1917 photograph and later eugenics organisations. Not direct employment, nothing that obvious, but donations, conference attendances, citations in papers. The network was there if you knew how to look for it. And then there was the question of the records themselves. Someone had carefully preserved that trunk full of evidence for over a century. Someone had hidden it in an attic, locked it away, but not destroyed it. Why? Lydia thought about the note. They were never meant to be found. Not never meant to exist. Not never meant to be known. Never meant to be found. Which implied that someone knew they existed. Someone was aware of these records, these dolls, these photographs. Someone had made a deliberate choice to hide them rather than destroy them. Was it guilt? An attack of conscience by someone involved in the project? Or was it insurance? Evidence kept safe in case it was ever needed to prove what had happened? Lydia would never know for sure. The person who'd hidden that trunk was long dead, their motivations buried with them. But the evidence remained, and now Lydia had to decide what to do with it. She thought about the children in those photographs, about Emma Rothschild and Thomas McCarthy, and Ruth Silverman, and the 39 others whose names were sewn into dolls. They'd been denied their identities, their histories, their choices. They'd been turned into data points in an experiment they never agreed to participate in. The least Lydia could do was tell their story, make sure people knew what had been done, give them back their names, even if she couldn't give them back anything else. She began writing up her findings, carefully documenting everything, preparing to publish. She contacted historical journals, pitched the story to magazines, reached out to documentary filmmakers. This was too important to keep to herself. The response was enthusiastic. Editors wanted the story. Producers wanted the rights. Academics wanted to collaborate on further research. Lydia felt like she was finally doing something right, finally giving these forgotten children a voice, and then the message arrived. Part 11, The Warning. It came through her email on a Tuesday morning. Lydia had been up late working on her manuscript, had finally gone to bed around 3 a.m. She woke to find the message waiting, sent at 4:37 while she slept. The sender address was just random. Characters: xk91 serpen f7del securemail.org. No subject line. The message was brief. We remember the children. We remember you found us. Stop digging. Lydia's coffee mug froze halfway to her lips. We remember you found us. Not found them. Found us. Someone claiming to be connected to the Isaac Project, or claiming to be descended from it, was watching her. Knew what she'd discovered, and wanted her to stop. She immediately forwarded the message to James, then tried to trace the headers. The email had bounced through multiple anonymous proxy servers across 3 countries. Professional-level obfuscation. Whoever sent this knew what they were doing. James called her within 5 minutes. Please tell me this is a prank. I don't think it is, Lydia said, her voice steadier than she felt. How would they even know what you're doing? You haven't published anything yet. That was a good question. Lydia had been careful. She'd written her research, yes, but it was still in draft form. She'd contacted a few historical journals, but those were confidential submissions. The only people who knew the full scope of what she'd found were James, a few genealogy forum members who'd shared family stories, and the archives, Lydia said suddenly. When we were in that building in the Bronx, what if there were cameras? The place looked abandoned. So did my farmhouse attic, but someone had been maintaining that trunk for over a century. Just because something looks forgotten doesn't mean it is. James was quiet for a moment. Okay, say you're right. Say there were cameras, and someone saw us in there. Who would that someone be? Who's still watching an off-site storage facility for 100-year-old files? Someone who has a reason to keep those files hidden. Descendants of the people involved. Institutional protection of university reputation, Lydia paused. Or maybe the network never completely died. Maybe there are still people who believe in what the Isaac Project represented. That's paranoid conspiracy theory territory. James, we literally broke into a secret archive containing evidence of eugenic experiments on children. We're already in conspiracy theory territory. The question is how deep it goes. Her phone buzzed. Another email, same anonymous sender. The families involved deserve privacy. Their descendants deserve peace. Publication would serve no purpose except harm. Be reasonable. Lydia read it aloud to James. That's a threat, he said. Vague, but definitely a threat. You need to go to the police. And tell them what? Someone sent me emails asking me not to publish historical research. That's not a crime. It's harassment. It's 2 emails. The police won't do anything. Lydia got up, started pacing. But whoever sent these thinks they can scare me off, which means they're worried, which means what we found is damaging enough to matter. Or it means they're dangerous and you should back off, Lydia thought, about the dolls lined up on her desk. About Emma Rothschild and Thomas McCarthy, and all the others whose names had been erased, whose lives had been used as data points, who disappeared into a system designed to exploit them. I can't back off. These children deserve to have their story told. These children are dead, Lydia. You're alive. Stay that way. She appreciated his concern, but she'd already made her decision. I'm not stopping, but I am going to be more careful. Over the next few days, Lydia took precautions. She backed up all her research to multiple cloud services. She sent copies of her key findings to trusted colleagues with instructions to publish if anything happened to her. She varied her daily routine, checked for anyone following her, kept her apartment door locked. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe the emails were just some internet troll who'd seen her posts on genealogy forums and decided to mess with her. But she didn't think so. On the 4th day after the first email, Lydia noticed a car parked across from her apartment building. A dark sedan with tinted windows, the same car she'd seen yesterday in the same spot. When she walked to the corner store that evening, the car was still there. When she returned an hour later, it was gone. The next morning it was back. She called James. I think someone's watching my apartment. Did you get a license plate? I tried. The angle's wrong from my window. I'm coming over. He arrived 20 minutes later, and together they watched from her living room window. The car sat there for another hour, then drove away. No one got out. No one approached the building. It was just watching. This is getting serious, James said. You should consider stopping, at least temporarily. Or I should accelerate, get everything published before they can stop me. Lydia, think about it. They're not trying to discredit my research. They're not claiming it's false or exaggerated. They're just telling me to stop, which means they know it's true and they know it's damaging. The best defense I have is to get it out there. Once it's public, there's no point in silencing me. James looked worried, but he nodded. Okay, then we move fast. I'll reach out to my contacts at academic journals, see who can fast-track peer review. You finish the manuscript. We flood the zone. Multiple publications, multiple platforms, all at once. Make it too big to suppress. Agreed. That night, Lydia worked until dawn, refining her arguments, strengthening her evidence, preparing her exposé. She was so focused that she almost didn't hear the sound. A soft scraping at her apartment door. She froze, listening. It came again, metal on metal. Someone was trying to pick her lock. Lydia grabbed her phone, dialed 911 and spoke in a whisper. Someone is trying to break into my apartment. The scraping stopped. Footsteps in the hallway, moving away quickly. By the time the police arrived 15 minutes later, whoever it had been was long gone. The officers took a report, checked her lock for damage, there was none. Whoever it was had been skilled, and told her to call if anything else happened. After they left, Lydia sat in her living room with all the lights on, unable to sleep. The message was clear. Someone could get to her. Someone wanted her scared. But fear could work both ways. If they were this desperate to stop her, it meant she was onto something real, something worth protecting at all costs, which meant she was close to the truth. And that made her more determined than ever to expose it. Part 12. The publication. Lydia didn't stop digging. If anything, the threats made her work faster. She and James coordinated a simultaneous release strategy. Her peer-reviewed article would be published in the Journal of Social History. A popular history magazine had agreed to run a feature story. A documentary producer was already assembling footage. And Lydia had posted preliminary findings on her professional blog, with links to source materials and photographs. The day the article went live, Lydia's inbox exploded. Media requests, interview offers, academic colleagues expressing shock and support, genealogists reaching out with new leads, and buried among the legitimate messages, more threatening emails from anonymous senders. You've made a terrible mistake. Some histories should stay buried. Consider what you've done to these families. Lydia read each one, documented them, and kept working. The threats confirmed what she already knew. She'd exposed something people with power wanted hidden. The response from the academic community was overwhelming. Other historians came forward with pieces of the puzzle they'd found over the years, fragments of evidence that hadn't made sense until now. Together, they built an even more complete picture of the Isaac Project and its connection to the broader eugenics movement. A genealogist in California discovered that one of the Isaac Project financial benefactors had also funded the Eugenics Record Office. A researcher at Yale found correspondence between Henry Falk and Charles Davenport, a leader of the American eugenics movement. The connections kept multiplying, but the most powerful responses came from the descendants. A woman in her 70s reached out crying as she told Lydia that her grandmother had been Subject 18. All her life, her grandmother had insisted she'd been part of something special as a child, but could never explain what. She'd kept a strange doll that looked like her as a girl, told fragmented stories about being observed and measured, but the family had dismissed it as confusion or fantasy. "Thank you for making her real," the woman said through tears. "Thank you for proving she wasn't imagining it. She told the truth, and nobody believed her." A man from Nebraska shared his great-uncle's journals, which described being selected for a rural improvement program and being sent to live with strangers who recorded everything he did. The family had thought he was exaggerating or seeking attention. Now they understood he'd been documenting his trauma. Story after story emerged of family legends that suddenly made sense, of unexplained adoptions, mysterious dolls, incomplete birth records, relatives who insisted they'd been part of experiments but could never prove it. Lydia had given them proof. She'd given them validation. And most importantly, she'd given their ancestors names and dignity. The Children's Aid Society issued a statement acknowledging that certain historical practices did not meet modern ethical standards, and pledging to cooperate with researchers seeking to understand this difficult chapter in their history. It was carefully worded corporate speak, but it was something. Columbia University issued a more substantial response, announcing they would open their restricted archives for scholarly research and establish a fund to support investigation into historical abuses in social science research. It wasn't an apology, but it was accountability. And slowly the threatening messages stopped. Maybe whoever had been sending them realized the story was too public to suppress. Maybe they decided that drawing more attention to themselves would only confirm Lydia's findings. Or maybe, and Lydia wanted to believe this, maybe they'd been acting out of misguided family loyalty, protecting ancestors who'd been involved, and seeing the truth laid bare had finally convinced them to let go. She'd never know for sure. The surveillance cars stopped appearing. The anonymous emails ceased. The attempted break-in was never followed up. It was as if whoever had been watching had simply stopped. Part 13. The Legacy. 6 months after publication, Lydia stood in a small museum in upstate New York. The Historical Preservation Society had decided not to demolish the farmhouse after all. Instead, they'd converted it into a memorial and education centre about the orphan train movement, with special focus on the Isaac project. The dolls were displayed in climate-controlled cases, each one labelled with the child's name, age, and whatever biographical information could be recovered. Emma Rothschild, age 4, Thomas McCarthy, age 7, Ruth Silverman, age 5, 42 children, no longer anonymous subjects, people with names and stories and descendants who remembered them. The trunk itself was preserved, along with the ledger and photographs. Visitors could read excerpts from Fawkes' letters, see the clinical language he'd used to describe children, understand the dehumanization that had occurred. But the exhibit didn't end with victimization. It also showed resistance. Letters from children who'd run away from placements, records of families who'd refused to participate in follow-up studies, documentation of social workers who'd objected to the program and tried to expose it. Not everyone had been complicit. Not everyone had accepted the abuse as normal, and it showed the aftermath. The ways this early eugenics research had influenced later policy, the forced sterilization programs that affected over 60,000 Americans, the immigration restrictions based on pseudo-scientific racial theories, the long shadow cast by the belief that some lives were worth less than others. Lydia stood in front of a panel featuring the 1917 alumni photograph. The exhibit text explained how some of the Isaac Project children had grown up to become researchers themselves, perpetuating the ideology that had been forced on them. But it also noted that not all of them had. Some had rejected the program, had spoken out against it, had worked to protect other children from similar treatment. Their resistance had been quieter, less documented, but it existed. A young woman approached Lydia as she stood there. "Excuse me, are you Lydia Crane, the researcher who found all this?" "I am." "Thank you." The woman's eyes were wet. "My great-great-grandmother was Ruth Silverman. I never knew her. She died before I was born. But my grandmother told me she used to have nightmares about being measured and examined as a child. We thought she'd been abused by her adoptive family. We never knew it was something bigger. I'm so sorry for what she went through." "Don't be sorry. Be proud. You gave her back her dignity. You made sure people know what happened." The woman smiled through tears. "She's not just a victim in our family stories anymore. She's a survivor. She's part of history. That matters." After the woman left, Lydia found herself in front of the final display panel. It showed modern child welfare protections, informed consent requirements for research, the systems put in place to prevent what had happened to the Isaac Project children from happening again. Progress wasn't inevitable, but it was possible, because people like Emma and Thomas and Ruth had endured something terrible, and because their stories had eventually been told, laws had changed. Protections had been established. Future children were safer. Their suffering hadn't been meaningless. It had led to change. That didn't make what happened to them right. It didn't justify the experiment or absolve the researchers, but it meant their stories had power, even a century later. Epilogue. Remembering. On her desk at home, Lydia kept one of the photographs, not the disturbing test group image, but a gentler picture from earlier in the collection. A child around 6 years old, smiling slightly, wearing a simple dress. The back of the photo read, "Before departure, 1887. Before the experiment, before the placement, before whatever happened next. Just a child captured in a moment before everything changed." Lydia looked at it sometimes when she was working late, researching some other forgotten corner of history. It reminded her why she did this work, why she dug through old records and dusty archives, why she asked uncomfortable questions and followed leads that more cautious people would abandon. Because someone has to remember. Someone has to bear witness. Someone has to make sure that the children who vanished aren't forgotten forever. The research continued. Other historians built on Lydia's work, finding more evidence of experimental programs, uncovering more stories of children who'd been used as research subjects. The Isaac Project wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern, a system, a belief that some people were less deserving of protection than others. But each story recovered was a victory. Each name restored was an act of resistance against the forces that had tried to erase them. Lydia published 2 more articles, then a book. The Children Who Vanished, Orphan Trains and the Hidden History of American Eugenics became required reading in social work programs and history departments. It sparked conversations about ethics in research, about informed consent, about whose stories get told and whose get buried, and sometimes, late at night when the only sound was the hum of her computer and the rustle of old papers, Lydia thought she could hear them. All those lost children, all those erased lives, whispering thank you. Thank you for finding us. Thank you for telling our story. Thank you for remembering. The dolls remained in their museum cases, their stitched faces frozen in eternal childhood. School groups toured the exhibit, learning about a dark chapter in American history. Researchers consulted the archives, building on Lydia's work. Descendants visited, connecting with ancestors they'd never known existed. Emma Rothschild had descendants who knew her name now, who understood where she came from, who recognised her trauma as real. Thomas McCarthy's story had been told in academic journals and popular history books. Ruth Silverman was no longer just Subject 23, but a person with a life and legacy. They were children who were used as experimental subjects in an era when such things were possible. They were victims of a system that valued scientific curiosity more than human dignity. They were forgotten for over a century, their stories buried under layers of institutional secrecy and deliberate destruction of evidence. But they're remembered now, their faces preserved in fabric and thread by someone who either felt guilty enough to document the crime or was proud enough to preserve the achievement, have become a testament to their existence. They were real, they mattered, and their story, however dark and disturbing, is part of American history, a history that must be remembered so it can never be repeated. The children who vanished have been found, and their story will not be forgotten again. One final note appeared in Lydia's research files, added months after the initial publication. She'd found it in an auction of estate materials from a descendant of one of the Isaac Project benefactors, a letter from Henry Falk, dated December 24th, 1922, near the end of his life. I have lived long enough to see my work discredited, my theories questioned, my legacy tarnished. Perhaps rightly so. I believed we were advancing human knowledge. I believed the children would benefit from our intervention. I believed the ends justified the means. I was wrong. They were not subjects. They were children. They deserved better than to be measured and observed and catalogued like specimens. They deserved to be loved, protected, allowed to simply be. If there is any mercy in this world, perhaps someday someone will find the records I've hidden, will tell the true story of what we did, and will ensure it never happens again. That would be the only worthwhile outcome of all this terrible work. Even Falk, the architect of the experiment, had come to regret it. Too late to help his subjects. Too late to undo the damage. But perhaps early enough to leave a record, to ensure that someday the truth would emerge. Lydia had found that record. She'd told that truth. And now the work continued without her direct involvement, spreading through the academic community and into popular consciousness. The children who vanished were vanishing no more. Their voices, silent for over a century, were finally being heard. And in archives and museums, in academic journals and family histories, their names would live on, not as subjects or case studies or data points, but as human beings who deserved to be remembered. Emma, Thomas, Ruth, and 39 others whose names were now known, whose faces had been preserved, whose stories would never be forgotten again. The Isaac Project had tried to use them. History had tried to erase them, but they had endured, in fabric and photographs and carefully hidden records, waiting for someone to find them. Lydia had found them, and now everyone would know. The glow of 17 monitors bathed Elias Corrin's face in an ethereal blue light as his fingers danced across 3 keyboards simultaneously. In the depths of his converted basement apartment, time moved differently. Days blurred into nights, and nights stretched endlessly as he navigated the labyrinthine pathways of the dark web like a digital archaeologist, uncovering humanity's buried secrets. At 32, Elias had already earned and lost 2 fortunes through his hacking prowess. The first fortune came easily, a teenage prodigy exploiting security vulnerabilities for corporate clients who paid millions to keep their weaknesses secret. He'd lived like a digital king, penthouses overlooking Silicon Valley, exotic cars that remained untouched in climate-controlled garages, while he preferred the glow of his monitors to sunlight. That first fortune vanished when he exposed Meridian Pharmaceuticals' cover-up of deadly side effects in their breakthrough arthritis medication. The leaked documents showed they'd known their drug caused cardiac episodes in 12% of patients over 60, but had buried the studies to protect their $10 billion investment. Elias had expected whistleblower protection. Instead, he found himself blacklisted from every major tech company, his reputation destroyed by a coordinated character assassination campaign that painted him as an unstable idealist who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. The second fortune came from smaller clients, criminal organisations, corporate espionage rings, government contractors who needed deniability. The work paid well but corroded his soul, each job pulling him deeper into the shadows of the digital underworld. That money disappeared into legal fees after a wrongful arrest for hacking the Federal Reserve, a crime he hadn't committed but couldn't prove he hadn't, given his reputation and the circumstantial evidence that seemed perfectly crafted to implicate him. 2 years in minimum security prison had shown him the true cost of challenging powerful systems. The other inmates respected his technical skills, but the guards treated him like a dangerous terrorist. Solitary confinement stretched for months whenever he complained about conditions or tried to organise better treatment for his fellow prisoners. By the time he was released on a technicality, evidence had mysteriously gone missing. He'd learned that the system didn't just punish dissent, it transformed dissidents into cautionary tales. Now, money meant nothing to him. Only truth mattered. His obsession with secret societies began innocently enough. A childhood fascination sparked by his grandfather's stories about World War II intelligence operations. The old man had worked as a codebreaker for the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, and had filled young Elias's imagination with tales of hidden messages and shadow wars. After his grandfather's death when Elias was 12, he'd found boxes of declassified documents in the attic, revealing just how much of recent history had been shaped by invisible hands. That childhood fascination evolved into a methodical hunt for evidence as he grew older and acquired the technical skills to dig deeper than amateur conspiracy theorists ever could. While other hackers chased Bitcoin fortunes and corporate espionage contracts, Elias pursued shadows and whispers, digital phantoms that most people dismissed as paranoid delusions. He'd spent years infiltrating closed forums where former intelligence operatives shared war stories, decrypting abandoned hard drives from defunct government contractors, and following digital breadcrumbs through the dark web's most obscure corners. His apartment had become a digital monastery dedicated to the pursuit of hidden truth, every surface covered with the tools and detritus of obsessive investigation. The apartment reflected his singular focus. Pizza boxes stacked like ancient monuments between towers of computer equipment, energy drink cans forming metallic armies across every surface, and cables snaking through the darkness like digital veins feeding his electronic ecosystem. His only companions were the hum of cooling fans working overtime to prevent his overclocked processors from melting down, and the occasional, satisfied grunt when another firewall fell to his expertise. The basement location was perfect for his needs, thick concrete walls that muffled sound and blocked electromagnetic interference, a dedicated power line that could handle his massive electrical requirements, and most importantly, no windows for curious neighbours to peer through. He'd been living there for 18 months, ever since his release from prison, paying cash to a landlord who asked no questions as long as the rent arrived on time. His setup was a temple to digital paranoia. 17 monitors arranged in a semicircle around his custom-built chair, each screen dedicated to different aspects of his ongoing investigations. 3 keyboards allowed him to manage multiple intrusion attempts simultaneously, while a collection of smartphones, each running different operating systems and connected to various networks through proxy chains, kept him connected to his sources around the globe. The walls were lined with hard drives, each containing terabytes of encrypted data collected from years of systematic investigation. Backup systems ensured that even if authorities raided the apartment, copies of everything would remain safely hidden in data centers across 3 continents. He'd learned from his previous arrests that physical evidence was only as secure as your ability to keep it out of enemy hands. Tonight felt different. As rain drummed against the boarded windows, he'd covered them himself for security reasons, Elias's automated scanners detected something unusual. The software he'd written monitored thousands of government servers simultaneously, looking for anomalous data signatures that might indicate classified information stored in supposedly routine systems. Most alerts were false positives, but after years of refinement, his algorithms had learned to distinguish between genuine anomalies and random digital noise. This particular signal was trying too hard to look ordinary, which was exactly what made it suspicious. A government proxy server deep within the Department of Homeland Security's network infrastructure was handling traffic patterns that didn't match any known legitimate use. The data packets were the right size and frequency to appear routine, but they carried encryption signatures that suggested military-grade security protecting something far more sensitive than typical administrative communications. Most hackers would have dismissed it as a honeypot, a trap designed to lure in digital intruders, but Elias had learned to read between the digital lines over years of careful observation. This signal felt different, older, like it had been running for decades without anyone paying attention to what it was actually protecting. He leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles with the deliberate ritual of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The proxy was 3 layers deep in government infrastructure, protected by military-grade encryption that would take months to crack through conventional means. But Elias had developed unconventional means over the years. His fingers resumed their dance, this time with the measured precision of a master pianist performing a familiar concerto. Code flowed across his screens like poetry written in 1s and 0s, each line bringing him closer to whatever lay hidden in the digital vault. As the final encryption layer crumbled at 3:47 a.m, Elias held his breath. The archive that materialized before him contained terabytes of data, but it was the file structure that made his pulse quicken. Everything was organized with the kind of meticulous care reserved for the most sensitive operations. Categorical folders with cryptic names like cultural implementation, behavioral modification, and asset management. He opened the first file and the world as he understood it began to unravel. The contracts appeared first, hundreds of them, stretching back decades like a paper trail through the shadow history of American culture. Entertainment companies, advertising agencies, record labels, movie studios, television networks, and news corporations all bound by identical non-disclosure agreements that ran to thousands of pages each. The legal language was deliberately obscure, buried in terminology that would confuse even experienced corporate lawyers who specialized in media contracts. But Elias had taught himself to decode legal doublespeak during his prison sentence, spending countless hours in the law library learning how power structures protected themselves through linguistic camouflage. Each contract referenced cultural programming initiatives and synchronized messaging protocols, with payment structures that dwarfed typical entertainment industry deals. Millions of dollars flowing to seemingly random projects, indie films that barely recouped production costs, music albums that never charted, advertising campaigns for products that didn't seem to exist. All payments were approved by a shell company called Apex Cultural Dynamics, whose corporate registration traced through a labyrinthine network of offshore entities. Elias followed the money trail through banks in Switzerland, shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, trust funds in Luxembourg, and holding companies in jurisdictions he'd never heard of. Every lead ultimately vanished into legal structures so complex they seemed designed more for obfuscation than profit. The internal memos were more revealing, written in the casual tone of executives who felt completely secure in their communications. Corporate leaders from supposedly competing companies discussed narrative adjustments and public sentiment cultivation, like weather forecasters predicting next week's conditions. One memo from a major news network's CEO, dated just 6 months ago, read, "Per our discussion with ACD representatives, the upcoming election cycle requires a 15% increase in anxiety-inducing content during primetime hours. Latest psychological impact studies suggest optimal effectiveness when paired with consumer advertising for comfort products and security solutions." Another memo from a streaming entertainment company outlined specific quotas. Q3 targets include 40% increase in dystopian future programming, 25% increase in surveillance state normalization themes, and introduction of transhumanist concepts through minimum of 12 original series. Demographic targeting should focus on the 18 to 34 age range for maximum long-term conditioning effectiveness. The coordination between supposedly independent media companies was breathtaking in scope. Competing networks shared detailed viewer psychological profiles, coordinated their news coverage to maximize specific emotional responses, and even synchronized their entertainment programming to reinforce particular worldviews. The memos discussed marketing research into subliminal messaging techniques, optimal timing for narrative reinforcement, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from organic cultural trends. Video stills scattered throughout the files showed meetings in nondescript conference rooms. Faces were often obscured, but the visible details painted a chilling picture. Executives from competing companies sitting side by side, reviewing presentations with titles like Mass Behavioral Prediction Models and Subliminal Integration Techniques. But it was the symbols that made Elias's blood run cold. They appeared everywhere, in corporate logos embedded in document headers, even watermarked into video files. The all-seeing eye perched atop pyramids, numerical sequences that corresponded to occult traditions, and geometric patterns that seemed random until viewed through the lens of esoteric knowledge. As dawn broke unnoticed outside his boarded windows, Elias began constructing his theory. The Illuminati weren't just folklore, they were real, organised, and operating in plain sight. Rather than ruling through force or political manipulation, they had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Cultural engineers who shaped reality through the careful manipulation of information and entertainment. The fragments suggested a coordinated effort spanning decades. Movies that promoted specific worldviews, music that carried subliminal messages, news coverage that guided public opinion toward predetermined conclusions. Every major cultural event seemed to serve a purpose beyond mere profit or entertainment. Elias created a new encrypted partition on his most secure drive and began organising the evidence. Each piece of the puzzle revealed new connections, new layers of coordination that defied conventional understanding of how media and culture operated. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying, but this was just the first door. As he prepared to dive deeper into the archive, a notification appeared on his screen. New files were uploading automatically to the server, added in real time from sources around the globe. The conspiracy wasn't just historical, it was happening now, every day, with machine-like precision. Elias smiled grimly and opened another energy drink. He had work to do. 3 days of continuous analysis revealed patterns so pervasive they defied coincidence. Elias's custom data mining algorithms had processed thousands of hours of Super Bowl halftime shows, major film releases, top-charting music, and primetime television programming, cross-referencing them with the archived documents he'd discovered. His software compared visual elements, audio frequencies, narrative structures, and symbolic content with mathematical precision that human observation alone could never achieve. The results were undeniable and terrifying. Every major halftime show since 2005 contained specific visual elements that served purposes beyond entertainment. Choreographed movements formed geometric patterns when viewed from aerial cameras, patterns that matched sacred geometry principles known to influence human consciousness. lighting sequences pulsed at precisely calibrated frequencies, 10 Hz to induce alpha brain states associated with relaxation and suggestibility, 40 Hz bursts to trigger gamma waves linked to heightened emotional responses, and infrasound frequencies below human hearing that created subliminal anxiety responses. The costume designs weren't random fashion choices. They incorporated symbols from the archived files with mathematical precision. Ancient Egyptian imagery, Masonic symbols, occult numerology, but presented in ways that bypassed conscious recognition. The performers themselves were likely unaware of the deeper significance, but the production companies certainly understood every detail. Internal emails discussed symbolic integration quotas and archetypal reinforcement targets with the clinical precision of pharmaceutical dosing guidelines. Hollywood's role was even more sophisticated, operating as a vast conditioning apparatus disguised as entertainment. Elias discovered that blockbuster films weren't just profitable products. They were psychological programming exercises designed to shift public consciousness over decades. Action movies systematically normalized surveillance states, extrajudicial violence, and the acceptability of authoritarian responses to perceived threats. Romantic comedies promoted specific relationship models that prioritize consumption, instant gratification, and emotional instability over lasting partnership and family formation. Science fiction films served as perhaps the most insidious tool of all. They introduced technological and social concepts years before their real-world implementation, ensuring public acceptance when they finally emerged. Movies about neural implants preceded actual brain-computer interface development by exactly the time needed for audience conditioning. Films depicting cashless societies appeared precisely when digital currency infrastructure was being developed. Dystopian scenarios were presented as cautionary tales, while simultaneously making the depicted future seem inevitable and acceptable. The music industry operated as the most direct delivery system for repetitive psychological messaging. Elias's analysis revealed that hit songs across all genres shared common structural elements designed to trigger specific neurological responses. Repetitive hooks created obsessive thought patterns, bass frequencies induced physical arousal responses, and lyrical themes consistently promoted materialism, emotional chaos, instant gratification, and distrust of traditional social bonds. Chart success wasn't organic. It was engineered through coordinated promotion campaigns that used psychological manipulation techniques, refined through decades of marketing research. Record companies employed neuroscience consultants who designed songs to be literally addictive, triggering dopamine responses that created compulsive listening behaviours. The most successful artists weren't necessarily the most talented. They were the most effective delivery vehicles for predetermined psychological content. But the most chilling discovery came when Elias cross-referenced celebrity deaths with financial markets and policy implementations, using algorithms that could detect correlations across vast datasets that human analysis would miss. The patterns were subtle but statistically undeniable. Whenever a particularly influential public figure died under questionable circumstances, the news cycle would shift dramatically within hours. Public attention would focus intensely on mourning and memorial coverage, while significant legislation passed through Congress, with minimal scrutiny or public debate. Michael Jackson's death had coincided with the most controversial aspects of healthcare reform debates, providing a massive distraction precisely when public opposition was reaching critical mass. Whitney Houston's demise dominated headlines during crucial banking regulation discussions that would have reshaped Wall Street oversight. Prince's passing created a week-long media obsession that completely buried coverage of surveillance law expansions that civil liberties groups had been fighting for months. Each event generated exactly the right emotional state to facilitate predetermined political outcomes. The deaths created collective grief that made the public more passive and receptive to authority, while the intensive media coverage consumed the attention bandwidth that might otherwise have focused on policy changes. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was orchestrated with mathematical precision. Elias found evidence suggesting that some celebrity deaths might have been actively induced rather than simply exploited. Medical records showed unusual patterns of prescription drug interactions. Security camera footage from crucial moments was consistently corrupted or missing, and autopsy results often contained anomalies that suggested external intervention. The pattern was consistent across dozens of cases spanning 3 decades. But even more disturbing was the systematic cultivation of celebrity instability. Internal documents from talent agencies and record companies outlined deliberate strategies for creating psychological dependence, drug addiction, and emotional instability in their most valuable assets. The goal wasn't profit maximization, it was creating performers who could be easily manipulated and, when necessary, destroyed at moments that served larger political purposes. The conspiracy had weaponized celebrity worship itself, turning the public's emotional investment in famous figures into a tool for mass psychological manipulation. Every death became a ritual that renewed the collective trauma bonding between citizens and their media-created gods, making the population more dependent on external authority figures and less capable of independent critical thinking. Elias created a digital conspiracy board on his largest monitor, a sprawling network of connections that would have impressed investigative agencies worldwide if they hadn't been complicit in the system he was mapping. Red lines linked entertainment companies to intelligence agencies through shared personnel, financial investments, and operational coordination. Blue lines traced money flows through the labyrinthine network of shell corporations, revealing how massive sums moved between seemingly unrelated organizations. Green lines mapped the precise timing of cultural events to policy implementations, showing correlation patterns that achieved statistical significance far beyond chance. The board revealed the Illuminati's true genius. They had weaponized human attention itself, transforming consciousness into a battlefield where wars were fought through carefully orchestrated information campaigns. In an age of information overload, controlling what people focused on had become more valuable than controlling what they thought. Distraction had evolved into the ultimate form of mind control, more effective than physical force because victims participated willingly in their own manipulation. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation, orchestrated through the entertainment media complex. Fashion cycles that promoted specific body images and consumption behaviours. Social media trends that encouraged narcissistic self-documentation and reduced attention spans. Political movements that channeled genuine grievances into harmless symbolic protests that changed nothing. Even conspiracy theories themselves appeared to be guided phenomena, designed to discredit legitimate questioning by associating it with obviously false claims. As Elias studied his creation through bloodshot eyes that hadn't seen natural light in days, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will and human autonomy. The manipulation wasn't just cultural, it was neurological. The constant stream of engineered content was literally rewiring human brains on a species level, creating generations of people whose thoughts and desires had been shaped by external forces since birth. The evidence suggested that the traditional concept of individual choice had become largely illusory. In a world where every piece of information was filtered through manipulated channels, where every cultural touchstone carried hidden programming, where every social trend was artificially generated, what did it mean to make an independent decision? The conspiracy had achieved something more insidious than totalitarianism. They had created voluntary slavery disguised as freedom of choice. As Elias studied his creation, a pattern emerged that made him question everything he thought he knew about free will. Every major cultural trend of the past 30 years could be traced back to deliberate manipulation. Fashion cycles, social media behaviours, political movements, even conspiracy theories, all potentially guided by the same hidden hand. The realization struck him like a physical blow. If they could control culture so completely, how could he be certain his own obsession with finding them wasn't part of their plan? The media conglomerate's server proved surprisingly easy to penetrate, which should have been Elias's first warning. Titan Communications owned 17 major news networks, 43 radio stations, controlling interests in 12 social media platforms, and content distribution deals with virtually every major streaming service. Their annual revenue exceeded the GDP of most small nations, and their influence over global information flow was effectively unparalleled in human history. Their security should have been impenetrable. Military contractors protected their networks. They employed former NSA specialists as cybersecurity consultants, and their server farms were housed in facilities that rivaled government installations. Yet Elias's intrusion tools sliced through their defences like a hot knife through butter, encountering minimal resistance and no countermeasures. It was almost as if they wanted him inside their systems. The internal documents were even more damning than the government archive, revealing coordination that made wartime propaganda efforts look amateur by comparison. Daily emails outlined narrative priorities for each news cycle, complete with psychological impact assessments, demographic targeting strategies, and measurable public sentiment targets. The language was coldly clinical, reducing human emotion and belief to data points on quarterly performance spreadsheets. Editorial meetings were recorded and transcribed with military precision. News directors from supposedly competing networks participated in weekly coordination calls, where they discussed upcoming stories, agreed on messaging frameworks, and divided coverage responsibilities to ensure comprehensive narrative saturation. The goal wasn't profit. It was behavioural modification on a civilizational scale. One particularly chilling document was titled MK-Ultra Evolution, Modern Behavioural Modification Through Repetitive Exposure. It outlined techniques that made the CIA's infamous mind control experiments look primitive and inefficient by comparison. Rather than targeting individuals through drugs and trauma, the new methods focused on mass psychological conditioning through carefully orchestrated media campaigns that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The manual explained in disturbing detail how repetitive exposure to specific imagery, sound frequencies, narrative structures, and emotional triggers could alter brain chemistry over extended periods. Citizens weren't being brainwashed in the traditional sense. They were being neurologically rewired through their daily media consumption, with changes that accumulated gradually over years and decades. The process was so subtle and pervasive that victims never realized their thoughts weren't entirely their own. Predictive programming emerged as a central technique in their arsenal. By introducing concepts, technologies, and social changes through fictional entertainment, before implementing them in reality, the manipulators could bypass critical thinking entirely. Audiences would unconsciously accept new surveillance technologies, social norms, and political systems because they had been psychologically prepared through years of entertainment conditioning that made the changes feel familiar and inevitable. The technique was devastatingly effective because it exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology. People naturally accepted ideas they had encountered multiple times, even if the initial exposure came through obviously fictional sources. The brain treated repeated fictional scenarios as potential realities, creating neural pathways that made actual implementation feel like a natural progression rather than a radical change. The financial section revealed the true scope of the operation. Trillions of dollars flowed through the network annually, dwarfing the budgets of most nations. The money came from unexpected sources: pension funds, insurance companies, even charitable foundations unknowingly contributed to the conspiracy through complex investment structures. But the most disturbing discovery was the coordination between intelligence agencies, banking institutions, entertainment corporations, and technology companies, operating as a unified organism despite their apparent competition and conflicting interests. Weekly video conferences brought together representatives from the CIA, Federal Reserve, major studios, social media platforms, and multinational technology corporations. They discussed sentiment management and narrative synchronization with the casual professionalism of corporate executives planning quarterly sales targets. The recordings revealed a shadow government that operated through corporate proxies rather than official political channels. Traditional governmental power had been largely superseded by a network of private organizations that could implement policy through market manipulation and cultural conditioning without the messy inconvenience of democratic oversight. Elections still occurred, but they had become elaborate theatre productions designed to maintain the illusion of popular sovereignty, while real decisions were made in boardrooms that the public never saw. News cycles weren't random or market-driven. They were orchestrated months in advance by committees that included intelligence operatives, banking executives, media moguls, and technology leaders. Wars provided distraction from economic manipulation while generating massive profits for defence contractors. Celebrity scandals offered convenient cover for political corruption investigations. Natural disasters created opportunities to implement emergency powers that somehow always became permanent fixtures of the expanded surveillance state. Every major event served multiple purposes in a grand design that stretched across decades. The 2008 financial crisis had been engineered to consolidate banking power while conditioning the public to accept bailouts as normal economic policy. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated digital transformation initiatives while normalising remote monitoring and social isolation. Climate change narratives were being used to justify energy sector reorganisation and carbon credit markets that would generate enormous profits for the same financial institutions that had caused previous economic crises. Elias found recorded conversations between news anchors and their handlers that destroyed any remaining illusion about journalistic integrity. Popular television personalities who projected authority and trustworthiness were revealed as knowing participants in psychological manipulation campaigns, carefully crafting emotional triggers with the precision of weapons designers. They discussed techniques for inducing specific brain states in viewers, optimal timing for fear-based messaging, and methods for making propaganda indistinguishable from legitimate news reporting. The most chilling recordings involved discussions of population control strategies disguised as public health initiatives. Representatives from pharmaceutical companies, government health agencies, and media corporations coordinated messaging campaigns designed to promote dependency on medical interventions while discouraging natural immunity and traditional healing practices. The goal wasn't public health. It was creating a population that required constant pharmaceutical management to function normally. Mental health treatment had been weaponized through carefully designed chemical interventions that didn't cure underlying problems but created permanent pharmaceutical dependencies. Educational systems were being restructured to produce workers who could follow complex instructions but lacked the critical thinking skills to question authority. Even exercise and nutrition guidelines were manipulated to ensure that optimal physical and mental health remained just out of reach for the general population. The evidence was overwhelming, but as Elias prepared to copy the files to his secure drives, an error message appeared. Access denied. User privileges revoked. The server was locking him out in real time, which meant someone was actively monitoring his intrusion. He worked frantically to extract what data he could, but the digital walls were closing in. As the connection terminated, one final document appeared briefly on his screen. A personnel file with his photograph and the header Asset Management, Elias Corin. Status, Active Monitoring. The file vanished before he could read it completely, but the implications were clear. They knew he was coming. Desperation drove Elias deeper into the network than he had ever dared venture. Using techniques that bordered on digital necromancy, he resurrected connection pathways that should have been impossible to access. The risk was enormous. Each probe left digital fingerprints that could lead authorities directly to his door. But the glimpse of his own file had transformed his quest from curiosity to survival. The recordings he discovered in the deepest server vaults were audio files from meetings that shouldn't have existed, according to any official record. High-definition audio captured conversations between intelligence officials, Federal Reserve board members, entertainment executives, technology billionaires, pharmaceutical industry leaders, and representatives from organizations he'd never heard of, but whose influence seemed to span continents. They discussed the future of human consciousness like generals planning military campaigns against an enemy population. The meetings followed a rigid schedule. Every third Wednesday of each month, participants would gather in a location identified only as the facility to review progress on what they called the Integration Project. The audio quality suggested advanced surveillance equipment, possibly indicating that someone within their organisation was documenting everything for purposes that remained unclear. One recording from a meeting dated 6 months ago made his blood freeze in his veins. Phase 7, implementation has exceeded all projections, reported a woman's voice that analysis software identified as belonging to a major pharmaceutical company executive. Antidepressant dependency rates have reached 23% of the adult population in target demographics. Cognitive function degradation is proceeding on schedule, with marked decreases in long-term planning abilities and resistance to authority structures. Another voice, male with a distinctive southern accent. The cryptocurrency infrastructure is approaching full readiness for behavioural tracking integration. Once we achieve real-time monitoring of every financial transaction, thought control becomes mathematically precise. Every purchase will inform our psychological profiles. Every payment will be subject to conditional approval based on compliance metrics. Money itself becomes the ultimate surveillance and control mechanism. A third voice, older and carrying unmistakable authority. Excellent progress. The entertainment division reports successful integration of transhumanist themes across all major platforms. Public acceptance of neural interface technology has increased 23% since the campaign began, with particularly strong adoption rates among the 18 to 34 demographic. We're ready for beta testing in select metropolitan markets next quarter. The conversations continued for hours, revealing a surveillance state that made Orwell's 1984 look like a children's story. They weren't just watching citizens, they were psychologically profiling entire populations in real time, predicting dissent before it emerged, and neutralizing threats through targeted manipulation rather than direct confrontation. The system was so sophisticated that most people would never realize they were living under complete psychological control. The integration project appeared to be the culmination of decades of research into human behavior modification. Rather than controlling people through force or obvious propaganda, they had created a system that guided human decision-making through carefully crafted environmental pressures. Every choice citizens made was influenced by factors they never recognized as external manipulation, creating the illusion of free will while ensuring predetermined outcomes. Food additives that affected brain chemistry, architectural designs that induced specific emotional states, lighting frequencies that influence circadian rhythms, sound pollution calibrated to create chronic stress. Every aspect of modern life had been optimized to create psychological conditions that made populations easier to manage. The genius was that victims participated willingly in their own subjugation, often defending the very systems that enslaved them. The Watcher Protocol emerged as their most sophisticated tool. Rather than silencing conspiracy theorists and dissidents, they monitored them continuously, studying their methods and psychology. The dye was used to identify others with similar thinking patterns, creating detailed maps of potential resistance before it could organize effectively. But the most chilling revelation was their approach to handling discovered threats. They didn't assassinate or imprison troublesome individuals, they drove them insane. Subtle psychological pressure, engineered coincidences, and carefully orchestrated personal tragedies would destroy a person's credibility and mental stability. Victims became their own worst enemies, discrediting themselves more effectively than any external force could. Elias found case studies documenting the destruction of dozens of individuals who had gotten too close to the truth. Journalists who suffered sudden career implosions, researchers who developed inexplicable mental health problems, hackers who became paranoid and unstable. The pattern was consistent. Initial discovery, followed by escalating pressure until the subject either retreated into obscurity or self-destructed publicly. As he absorbed this information, strange coincidences began occurring in his own life. His internet connection inexplicably slowed at crucial moments. Phone calls developed electronic interference. His food delivery orders were mysteriously cancelled or delayed. Each incident was minor and easily dismissed as random bad luck, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Someone was watching. Elias tried to dismiss his growing paranoia as a natural reaction to the disturbing information he was processing. But late at night, when the city was quiet and his monitors provided the only light, he sometimes heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. They would pause at his door for exactly 30 seconds before continuing down the corridor. The recordings had mentioned something else, something that made his hands shake as he worked. Subject 347 shows exceptional pattern recognition abilities. Psychological profile suggests high probability of success in reaching final verification stage. Recommend maintaining current stimuli until extraction protocols can be implemented. He had no way of knowing for certain, but the timing suggested a horrible possibility. He might be Subject 347. The decision to leak his findings publicly felt like stepping off a cliff. Elias had accumulated enough evidence to expose a conspiracy that dwarfed anything in human history, but he knew that releasing it would likely cost him his life, or worse, his sanity. Yet the alternative was remaining silent while humanity sleepwalked toward a digital totalitarianism that would make physical oppression obsolete. He began by seeding information across the dark web's most secure forums, using identity masking techniques that should have made him untraceable. The posts were carefully crafted to appear as random discoveries by different users, avoiding the pattern recognition algorithms that monitored conspiracy communities. Each fragment of evidence was real but incomplete, requiring readers to connect the dots themselves. The response was immediate and disturbing. His posts gained traction quickly, too quickly. Within hours, they were being shared across platforms, analysed by citizen journalists, and discussed in mainstream media as examples of dangerous misinformation. The speed of the reaction suggested a coordinated response, as if the revelation had been anticipated and prepared for in advance. More troubling was the nature of the responses. While some users took the evidence seriously, others immediately began discrediting it with arguments that seemed too sophisticated to be spontaneous. They pointed to technical inconsistencies that Elias was certain didn't exist, questioned source authenticity with forensic expertise that suggested professional training, and redirected discussions toward harmless tangents that neutered the information's impact. Within days, his revelations were being treated as another internet conspiracy theory, filed alongside flat earth theories and lizard people claims. The evidence was dismissed not through logical refutation, but through association with obviously false ideas, a technique the archived documents had called cognitive contamination. As the online discussions evolved, Elias realised he was watching a masterpiece of psychological manipulation in real time. The truth was being buried not through censorship, but through calculated flooding with disinformation. His genuine evidence was drowning in a sea of deliberate nonsense, making it impossible for reasonable people to distinguish fact from fantasy. But the digital warfare was only the beginning. Physical reality began shifting around him in subtle but unmistakable ways. His internet speed slowed to a crawl whenever he tried to upload new evidence. Delivery services could no longer find his address. His phone developed a mysterious static that made conversations nearly impossible. Even his electricity began fluctuating at random intervals, causing his equipment to crash at the most inconvenient moments. The psychological pressure was more sophisticated than anything he had imagined from the case studies. Rather than obvious intimidation, he faced a constant series of minor inconveniences and technical failures that could be dismissed as coincidence by anyone who wasn't experiencing them directly. The effect was maddening, literally. He began questioning his own perceptions, wondering if paranoia was making him see patterns that didn't exist. Sleep became elusive as his apartment filled with unexplained sounds. Electronics hummed at frequencies that seemed designed to prevent rest. The heating system cycled erratically, creating temperature fluctuations that made comfort impossible. Water pressure dropped whenever he tried to shower, and his refrigerator developed a whine that stopped only when he was away from his computer. Friends and family members began expressing concern about his mental state, though he couldn't remember telling them about his research. They called with surprising frequency, all using similar language about the importance of seeking help and taking breaks from the computer. The conversations felt scripted, as if his loved ones were reading from prepared statements. As days blended into a haze of technical failures and social pressure, Elias realised he was living inside one of the case studies he'd discovered. They weren't just monitoring him, they were actively dismantling his life with surgical precision. But unlike the previous victims, he knew what was happening. That knowledge might be his only chance of survival. He had to reach the final layer of the archive before they completed their psychological destruction. If his theory was correct, the deepest files would contain the ultimate revelation, and possibly his salvation. The final server required every technique Elias had learned over 2 decades of hacking, protected by quantum encryption and guarded by AI systems that adapted to his intrusion attempts in real time. It represented the pinnacle of digital security. Yet as he worked through the night, fueled by desperation and the last of his energy drinks, the barriers fell with almost suspicious ease. The locked folder contained exactly what he had expected and feared: complete dossiers on hundreds of individuals, including himself. His file was massive, containing information that should have been impossible to collect. Screenshots of every computer session going back years, audio recordings from devices that shouldn't have had microphones, even biometric data tracking his health and emotional states in real time. But it was the analysis that truly horrified him. Psychological profiles predicted his behaviour with uncanny accuracy, mapping his personality down to neurological quirks that he had never shared with anyone. The files detailed his childhood trauma, relationship patterns, cognitive biases, and emotional triggers with clinical precision. They knew him better than he knew himself. The surveillance had begun long before his current investigation. Webcam captures showed him staring at monitors in his apartment, taken from angles that suggested multiple hidden cameras. Phone conversations with friends and family had been recorded and analysed for stress patterns and emotional manipulation opportunities. Even his online shopping habits, medical records, and financial transactions had been fed into behavioural prediction algorithms. Most disturbing was the timeline. The earliest entries in his file dated back 15 years, to when he had first begun investigating conspiracy theories as a college student. They hadn't just discovered his activities, they had been watching and shaping them from the beginning. Every major breakthrough in his hacking skills, every connection he had made in underground communities, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered, all had been carefully orchestrated. The documents revealed the true scope of his manipulation. The pharmaceutical company he had exposed years earlier, the leaked documents had been strategically placed for him to find. The wrongful arrest that had cost him his fortune, engineered to isolate him and fuel his paranoia. Even his current apartment had been selected for him, the basement location perfect for the psychological pressure techniques they planned to employ. But the most shattering revelation was still to come. As he scrolled through terabytes of personal data, a video file caught his attention. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 days ago, the night he had first accessed the government server. The video showed him working at his computer, but the angle was impossible. The camera had to be inside his monitor, watching him as he discovered the conspiracy. He was staring at footage of himself reading about his own surveillance. The video continued, showing him creating his digital conspiracy board, making connections between entertainment companies and intelligence agencies, even the moment when he had first seen his own photograph in the corporate files. But there was something else, a timestamp in the corner that made no sense. According to the file properties, the video had been created 6 months before it was allegedly recorded. His hand shaking, Elias cross-referenced the timestamp with other files in his dossier. The pattern that emerged destroyed everything he thought he knew about his investigation. Every revelation, every breakthrough, every piece of evidence he had discovered, all had been prepared in advance. The conspiracy he had uncovered was real, but his discovery of it had been choreographed down to the minute. They hadn't just been watching him, they had been directing him, feeding him information at precisely calculated intervals, allowing him to feel the satisfaction of discovery while ensuring he found only what they wanted him to find. His entire investigation was a performance, and he had been playing his role perfectly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment was no longer mysterious. It was his cue that the final act was about to begin. The timestamp that shattered Elias's world appeared in a routine system log, buried among thousands of other entries he might have overlooked in his haste to process the overwhelming data. But his pattern recognition skills, honed by decades of digital archaeology, caught the anomaly immediately. His surveillance file had been created 3 years before he had even begun his serious investigation into secret societies. Not updated, not modified, created. The implications spread through his mind like digital wildfire. Every forum post that had sparked his interest, every breadcrumb of evidence he had followed, every contact who had guided him toward new information sources, all had been carefully planted elements in an elaborate psychological experiment. He wasn't hunting the Illuminati. He was their laboratory rat, navigating a maze they had constructed specifically for him. The files reveal the true scope of the operation. Project Cassandra aimed to study how individuals with specific psychological profiles could be guided toward predetermined conclusions while believing they were conducting independent research. Elias was test subject 347 in a series that had already processed thousands of potential dissidents, conspiracy theorists, and amateur investigators. The methodology was diabolical in its sophistication. Rather than suppressing information, they had created controlled leaks that satisfied the subject's desire for hidden truth, while ensuring that any revelations served their ultimate purposes. Every conspiracy theorist who believed they had uncovered secret plots was actually participating in a massive behavioural study that helped refine mass manipulation techniques. But Project Cassandra served another purpose, creating the perfect patsies. When subjects like Elias inevitably attempted to share their discoveries, the public would dismiss them as delusional paranoids. The conspiracy theorists discredited themselves more effectively than any government censorship could, providing cover for the real operations happening in plain sight. The genius was circular. They used genuine conspiracies to hide their conspiracy to create conspiracy theories. The Ouroboros of manipulation consumed its own tail while strengthening the head. Elias found video recordings of planning meetings where researchers discussed his psychological profile like entomologists studying an insect. His obsessive personality, his need for validation through intellectual superiority, his isolation and distrust of mainstream society, all were noted as advantageous traits for the experiment. They had identified him as an ideal subject before he had even begun his journey into the digital underground. The recordings were clinical in their detachment. Subject 347 shows exceptional persistence and pattern recognition abilities. Recommend accelerating the revelation timeline to achieve maximum psychological impact. His technical skills allow for more sophisticated evidence plants than previous subjects. Agreed. The deep web forums are seeded and ready. Will allow him to discover the entertainment industry connections next week, followed by the financial networks the following month. Estimated timeline to complete breakdown, 6 to 8 months. What about extraction? Standard protocol. Once he achieves full paranoid state, we'll activate the final revelation. The cognitive dissonance should ensure complete psychological collapse within 72 hours. Subject will either retreat into catatonic withdrawal or self-eliminate. Either outcome serves project goals. The footsteps outside his door had stopped. In the silence that followed, Elias could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a countdown timer. Every shadow in his peripheral vision might be a hidden observer. Every electronic device could be a surveillance tool. Even his own thoughts felt compromised, infected by the knowledge that his mind had been invaded and mapped by researchers who understood his psychology better than he did. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him completely, a final realization emerged from the chaos of his collapsing worldview. If they had created all of this as an experiment, if his investigation was a carefully orchestrated performance, then the evidence he had found might be real after all. They couldn't manipulate him with fake conspiracies. They had to use genuine ones to make the manipulation believable. The entertainment industry coordination, the financial manipulation, the psychological conditioning of entire populations, it was all real. His discovery of it might have been staged, but the conspiracy itself existed exactly as he had uncovered it. They had made one critical error in their psychological experiment. They had given him access to the truth. The question was whether that knowledge could serve any purpose now that he understood his role as an unwitting puppet. As the footsteps resumed outside his door, moving with deliberate slowness toward his apartment, Elias realized he had perhaps minutes to decide how this story would end. He could retreat into madness as they expected, becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of conspiracy thinking. He could attempt to fight back, though they had mapped every aspect of his psychology and would anticipate any strategy he might devise. Or he could find a third option, something they hadn't planned for because it lay outside their understanding of his character. The gentle knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. A voice, polite and professional, spoke through the thin wood. "Mr. Corrin, we need to talk." Elias looked at his screens one final time, at the conspiracy board that had consumed his life, at the evidence that proved humanity was being manipulated on a scale beyond historical precedent. Then he looked at his reflection in the dark monitor, the face of a man who had discovered that his greatest fear and greatest hope were the same thing. He had found the truth. The truth had been carefully crafted to find him. But perhaps, in that circular dance of manipulation and discovery, lay an opportunity that neither he nor his watchers had anticipated. After all, even the most sophisticated psychological experiment could produce unexpected results. As he reached for the door handle, Elias Corrin smiled for the first time in months. If they had taught him anything, it was that reality was far more malleable than most people believed. And if reality could be shaped, then perhaps it was time for the subject to become the experimenter. The door opened to reveal figures in dark suits, their faces professional masks hiding whatever emotions they might have felt. But as they looked into Elias's eyes, something shifted in their expressions, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested their psychological profiles might have missed something crucial about their carefully studied subject. "Gentlemen," Elias said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "I've been expecting you. Shall we discuss what happens next?" The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dive investigations into the mysteries that keep us wondering. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Now let's get into something that might change how you think about what's beneath our feet. There's a single frame of VHS footage that refuses to leave my mind. A middle-aged man standing at a podium in Denver. The year is 1995. His hands shake slightly as he holds the microphone, but not from nervousness. These are the tremors of someone whose nervous system has been fundamentally damaged, whose body carries the physical evidence of trauma that most people couldn't survive. Behind him, a grainy projection shows geological cross-sections of northern New Mexico, layers of sediment and rock with annotations in his own handwriting. He's talking about underground bases, about things he claims to have seen with his own eyes, about a firefight that supposedly happened 16 years earlier in tunnels that officially don't exist. His name was Phil Schneider. The quality of the tape is terrible, degraded by time and multiple duplications, but you can still see the surgical scars on his hands where fingers used to be. You can still hear the conviction in his voice when he describes the smell of the tunnels, the sound of weapons fire echoing through chambers carved from living rock, the bodies of colleagues who never made it back to the surface. 1 year after this lecture, he would be found dead in his apartment in Wilsonville, Oregon, a catheter hose wrapped around his neck so tightly that it took considerable force. The official ruling, suicide. His hands, the same hands that were missing multiple fingers, allegedly managed to strangle himself with enough pressure to crush his larynx. The people who knew him said Phil Schneider was many things, but he wasn't suicidal. He was angry. He was determined. He was convinced that the public deserved to know what their government was doing in the deep places of the earth. But in that lecture, in that single moment captured on deteriorating magnetic tape, he says something that cuts through decades of conspiracy noise like a scalpel through flesh. He leans into the microphone and his voice drops to almost a whisper, as if he's afraid of being overheard even in a public venue. They're still there, under Archuleta Mesa, still working, still waiting. The camera wobbles, someone in the audience coughs. Phil Schneider's hands grip the podium, and for just a moment you can see something in his eyes that transcends fear. It's certainty. The absolute knowledge of someone who has seen something they can never unsee. This is the story of what happens when you decide to find out if he was telling the truth. This is the story of what happens when you look for a door that was never meant to be found. This is the Dulce Protocol. The Man Who Never Came Back, June 1979. The high desert of northern New Mexico bakes under relentless sun that turns the landscape into something alien and unforgiving. Phil Schneider, a former Los Alamos explosives technician with 17 years of experience in underground construction, stands at the edge of what will become the most controversial claim of his life. According to his later testimony, delivered in conference rooms and small venues across America in the mid-90s, he's part of a construction crew drilling into the mesa near the small town of Dulce. They're building something deep, something that requires specialized knowledge of underground detonation and structural engineering in extreme conditions. The project is classified. The workers don't know what they're building, only that it's important enough to warrant the presence of armed military personnel and security protocols that seem excessive for a simple construction job. Schneider was good at his work. He'd helped build underground facilities before, part of the vast network of hardened structures the US government constructed during the Cold War. Deep command bunkers, missile silos, facilities designed to survive nuclear war. He knew rock composition, load-bearing calculations, the precise amount of explosive needed to carve chambers from solid stone without causing catastrophic collapse. But on this particular day in June, something goes wrong. The drill bit boring through layers of sedimentary rock and volcanic tuff suddenly drops into empty space. The change in resistance is immediate and unmistakable. They've broken through into a cavity, a void that shouldn't exist according to the geological surveys. The crew pulls the bit back, and air rushes out of the hole. Not the stale, dead air of a sealed pocket, but moving air. Air that's been somewhere. According to Schneider's account, what happens next changes everything. They widen the hole, prepare to investigate. Standard procedure dictates caution, gas detection, structural assessment. But before they can complete their safety protocols, something comes through from the other side. The official story, if there even is one, has been buried under layers of classification and deliberate confusion. Government documents related to the Dulce construction project from 1979 are still sealed, their very existence neither confirmed nor denied. But Schneider would spend the last years of his life telling anyone who would listen about what happened next. About the tunnel they found, already excavated, showing evidence of construction methods that didn't match any human engineering he recognised. About the entities they encountered, beings, that didn't respond to verbal commands or warning shots the way humans would. About the firefight that erupted when security forces arrived and attempted to assert control. About the beams of light that cut through rock and flesh with equal ease. About the screaming that echoed through chambers that went deeper than their maps suggested possible. Schneider claimed that 67 people died that day. Military personnel, construction workers, security contractors. He said he survived only because a Green Beret allegedly threw him away from one of the directed energy weapons the entities were using, taking the fatal blast himself. Schneider's hands told their own story. Missing fingers, burned scars. Nerve damage so extensive that he struggled with fine motor control for the rest of his life. His medical records, the ones he shared publicly, documented radiation exposure inconsistent with any civilian source. His disability claim cited injuries sustained in the line of duty during classified operations, language carefully chosen to reveal nothing while confirming something happened. Fast forward to 2021. Elias Ford sits in his cramped graduate student apartment in Los Angeles, the blue glow of his laptop screen illuminating stacks of research papers about government transparency, press freedom, and the limits of FOIA requests. Empty coffee cups form a small mountain on his desk. His thesis advisor's increasingly concerned emails sit unanswered in his inbox. His girlfriend stopped calling 3 weeks ago after one too many conversations that started with dinner plans and ended with theories about underground facilities. He's watching that Denver lecture for the 47th time, and he started keeping count because he's begun to notice things, small details, the way Schneider's left eye twitches when he mentions specific dates, the way he grips the podium when describing the entities, the way his voice breaks, genuinely breaks, when he talks about the men who didn't make it out. Elias isn't a conspiracy theorist, at least not the kind who sees patterns in pizza restaurant logos, or believes in shape-shifting reptilians running world governments. He's methodical, trained in verification and source analysis, taught to follow evidence wherever it leads, and to trust documentation over speculation. His undergraduate work in investigative journalism earned him awards. His professors called him unusually rigorous in his approach to research. But something about Schneider's testimony gnaws at him with the persistence of a splinter working its way deeper under the skin. It's not what the man says, it's how he says it. The specific details, the technical language that rings true to anyone who knows construction and engineering. The way he references real places, real agencies, real protocols. The way his voice cracks when he describes the smell of ozone and burnt flesh. A description so visceral and specific that it feels like sense memory rather than fabrication. People who lie tend to embellish. They add dramatic details, create heroic narratives, paint themselves as central figures in grand conspiracies. Schneider's account is almost clinically spare. He doesn't claim to understand what he encountered. He doesn't pretend to have special knowledge of alien civilizations or government conspiracies. He simply describes what he says he experienced. in the language of a construction worker who found something he wasn't supposed to find. And then there's the death. January 7th, 1996. Phil Schneider found dead in his apartment after being missing for several days. The autopsy report, publicly available, notes the catheter hose wrapped around his neck with enough force to crush the hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage. The medical examiner ruled it suicide, but Elias has read that autopsy report a dozen times, and the details bother him. Schneider's hands, already damaged and missing fingers, would have struggled to generate the force necessary for that kind of strangulation. The positioning of the ligature suggested pressure applied from behind and above, awkward for self-infliction. There were no drugs in his system, no alcohol, nothing to suggest impaired judgment or suicidal ideation. Friends and family insisted Schneider was preparing for more lectures. He had bookings scheduled. He was working on a presentation about government black budgets. He told multiple people he had more information to share, documents he was still organising. Then he was dead, and the narrative shifted from whistleblower to troubled man who took his own life. Elias makes a decision that will unravel his life, though he doesn't know it yet. He's going to find out what really happened at Dulcie. He's going to treat this like a real investigation, following evidence, tracking down sources, building a case that can withstand scrutiny. He's going to assume Schneider was telling the truth and see where that assumption leads. It's 2 a.m. when he creates a new folder on his laptop, Dulcie Protocol. Inside, he begins cataloguing everything he can find. Schneider's lectures, transcribed word for word. Geological surveys of the Archuleta Mesa region. Historical records of construction projects in northern New Mexico during the late 70s. News articles about cattle mutilations. Reports of UFO sightings. Missing person cases. The coffee goes cold as he works. Outside his window, Los Angeles sleeps. And somewhere in New Mexico, beneath a mesa that rises from high desert like a monument to secrets, machinery hums in tunnels that officially don't exist. Elias doesn't sleep that night. He's crossed a threshold, made a commitment to a path that will consume him. In the morning he'll start making calls. He'll reach out to witnesses, researchers, anyone who might remember the events of 1979. But for now, he watches the lecture one more time. Phil Schneider's damaged hands gripping the podium, his voice carrying the weight of truth that no one wants to hear. They're still there, under Archuleta Mesa, still working, still waiting. Waiting for what, Elias wonders, and more importantly, waiting for whom? Act 1. The history they don't talk about real-world origins. Every conspiracy theory has an origin point. A moment where documented reality blurs into speculation, where the solid ground of verifiable fact gives way to the quicksand of possibility. For Dulcie, that moment begins not with a dramatic revelation, but with routine police work in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. October 1967. The town of Dulcie, population roughly 2,000, sits in the high country of northern New Mexico like a secret the landscape is trying to keep. It's Jicarilla Apache reservation land, a place of stunning vistas and deep cultural significance, where the modern world sits uncomfortably alongside traditions that stretch back centuries. The town itself is small, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the arrival of strangers is noticed and remembered. New Mexico State Police records from that October tell a story that doesn't fit comfortably into official narratives. Multiple officers, working different shifts, responding to different calls, all report the same thing. Lights in the sky near Archuleta Mesa, not distant aircraft lights or stars misidentified by unreliable witnesses. These are objects moving in patterns that violate basic physics as the officers understand it. Patrolman James Bustamante files a report on October 14th, describing an object that appeared stationary for 17 minutes before accelerating to impossible speed with no visible means of propulsion. His report is detailed, clinical, the work of a professional trying to document something that challenges his understanding of reality. He notes wind conditions, visibility, the presence of his partner as a corroborating witness. He sketches the object's flight path and estimates its size relative to known landmarks. 3 days later, Sergeant Maria Sanchez reports a similar sighting from a different location, then Officer Thomas Whitehorse, then others. The reports accumulate in files that will sit in archives for decades, neither investigated nor explained, simply recorded and filed away under classifications that ensure they won't be casually discovered. These aren't anonymous reports from unreliable witnesses claiming they were abducted or probed. These are sworn law enforcement officials filing paperwork that could affect their careers and credibility, documenting something they can't explain but can't deny they witnessed. The sightings continue sporadically over the next several years. Sometimes months pass between reports. Sometimes multiple sightings occur within days. The pattern is inconsistent enough to resist easy explanation, but persistent enough to establish that something unusual is happening in the airspace around Archuleta Mesa. Then comes the cattle mutilation wave, and the strangeness takes on a darker character. Between 1975 and 1979, ranchers across northern New Mexico report something that transforms the region from mysterious to actively frightening. Cattle found dead in fields, their bodies surgically altered with precision that baffles veterinarians and law enforcement alike. The cases share disturbing commonalities that suggest systematic rather than random events. The animals are found drained of blood, their bodies showing no signs of bloating or decomposition that would normally occur within hours of death. Organs are removed through incisions so clean they appear to be made with surgical instruments far more precise than any farmer or veterinarian in the region possesses. Eyes excised with circular cuts, tongues removed through the jaw, reproductive organs extracted with what forensic veterinarians describe as laser-like precision. No blood pools around the bodies, no tracks approach or leave the carcasses, no signs of predation, no evidence of scavengers, just the bodies, arranged in ways that seem almost deliberate, as if left as messages or warnings. Local veterinarian Thomas Chen examines dozens of these animals between 1976 and 79. His reports, preserved in county records and later obtained through FOIA requests, note details that defy conventional explanation. Hemoglobin levels in remaining tissue suggest rapid exsanguination, but there's no blood at the scene. Incision edges show heat damage at the cellular level, consistent with cauterization by directed energy rather than cutting by blade. In several cases, bones appear to have been softened or partially dissolved to allow organ removal through impossibly small openings. These are not predator kills, Chen writes in a report dated March 1978. These are not the work of cultists or pranksters. The precision and methodology suggest technology and knowledge beyond what any civilian operation would possess. I have no explanation that satisfies the evidence. In March of 1979, the phenomenon reaches a crescendo. Local rancher Manuel Gomez discovers 17 mutilated cattle on his property over a span of 8 days. The animals represent a significant portion of his herd, thousands of dollars in losses that insurance refuses to cover, because no one can determine the cause of death. Gomez is the third generation of his family to work this land. He knows cattle. He knows predators. He knows what natural death looks like. What he finds in his fields is something else entirely. He calls the sheriff. He calls the state police. He calls federal authorities. A team from the FBI's Albuquerque field office arrives to investigate, part of a broader multi-state effort to understand the cattle mutilation phenomenon that's been terrorizing ranchers across the Southwest. The FBI reports, later released through FOI gay requests after decades of classification, make for disturbing reading. Special agents document incision patterns, tissue samples, the complete absence of forensic evidence that would normally accompany either human or animal predation. They interview ranchers, veterinarians, local law enforcement. They consult with pathologists and forensic specialists. Their conclusions are carefully worded, written in the bureaucratic language designed to convey information without making inflammatory statements. But one phrase appears 17 times across multiple reports, always in quotes, as if the agents writing the reports want to distance themselves from the implications. Cutting instruments of unknown origin. Unknown origin. Not advanced surgical tools, not specialised equipment. Unknown origin, as if the FBI, with all its resources and expertise, cannot identify what created these precise, cauterised incisions in dead cattle across the American Southwest. The mutilation wave creates a climate of fear in rural New Mexico. Ranchers start keeping their cattle closer to their homes. People install lights, motion sensors, cameras. Some organise armed patrols. The economic impact is substantial, but the psychological impact is greater. This is a region where people pride themselves on self-reliance, on understanding their land and its dangers. But how do you defend against something you can't identify, that leaves no evidence, that operates with technology you don't understand? Then, in 1980, the story takes another turn with the introduction of Paul Bennewitz. Bennewitz was a physicist and inventor who ran Thunder Scientific Corporation in Albuquerque, a successful business that manufactured precision instruments for measuring humidity and temperature. He held patents, he had government contracts, he'd done work for classified programs. This wasn't a crank or a paranoid recluse. This was a respected member of the scientific community with security clearances and a reputation for rigorous, methodical work. He lived near Kirtland Air Force Base, home to numerous sensitive operations and one of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons facilities. His house sat on a hill with a clear view of the base's remote sections, areas where unusual activity sometimes occurred after dark. Being a scientist and an inventor, Bennewitz had equipment, radio receivers, recording devices, cameras with telephoto lenses. He was curious by nature and by profession, the kind of person who notices patterns and wants to understand their underlying causes. In 1980, he began intercepting strange radio signals. Bennewitz was experienced with radio technology. He understood frequency allocation, transmission protocols, the characteristic signatures of different types of communications equipment. What he was receiving didn't match anything in his experience. Low-frequency transmissions, pulsed in patterns that suggested data transfer rather than voice communication, coming from a bearing that pointed northeast of Albuquerque. He triangulated the signals using multiple receivers at different locations. The source appeared to be somewhere in the direction of Dulce, New Mexico, approximately 120 miles away, in the vicinity of Archuleta Mesa. Bennewitz did what any responsible scientist would do. He documented everything meticulously. He recorded the signals, he analysed their patterns, he created maps showing the apparent source location. He compiled his findings into a detailed report, and then he did something that would change his life irrevocably. He approached the Air Force with his findings. You have to understand the context. This is 1980. The Cold War is still very much active. The Soviet Union represents an existential threat. Kirtland Air Force Base is a strategic facility housing nuclear weapons and conducting classified research. An experienced physicist and defence contractor reporting unusual signals in the vicinity of sensitive installations would normally be taken seriously, and they did take him seriously, but not in the way Bennewitz expected. What happened next is documented fact, confirmed by declassified documents and later admissions by intelligence officials. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations didn't investigate Bennewitz's claims. They investigated Bennewitz himself, and then they began one of the most elaborate and sustained psychological operations ever conducted against a private US citizen. They fed him disinformation. They encouraged his most paranoid theories. They provided him with forged documents suggesting underground bases and alien technology. They sent agents posing as fellow researchers to feed him elaborate stories. They monitored his communications, his movements, his mental state. Over several years, they systematically destroyed Paul Bennewitz's grip on reality. By the mid-80s, Bennewitz was hospitalized for psychological treatment. His business suffered. His family relationships fractured. the brilliant physicist who'd held security clearances and government contracts, became known as a delusional conspiracy theorist. His legitimate findings about unusual signals drowned in a sea of false information fed to him by the very people he'd tried to help. Benowitz died in 2003. His reputation never fully recovered. And the question that haunts his story, the question that draws researchers like Elias decades later, is simple. Why would the US Air Force devote years of resources and sophisticated psychological warfare techniques to discrediting one man unless he'd actually found something they needed to keep hidden? Elias begins digging. Elias's investigation begins with phone calls to people who don't want to remember, to people who've spent decades trying to forget, to people who made peace with burying the truth so deeply that excavating it feels like a violation. Manuel Gomez died in 2003, his final years marked by declining health and a reluctance to discuss the events of '79. But his daughter, Rosa Gomez Martinez, still lives on the family ranch, maintaining the land her grandfather cleared and her father expanded. When Elias reaches her after 3 weeks of trying to track her down, there's a long pause after he introduces himself and his research topic. He can hear her breathing on the other end of the line, can hear the sound of wind through an open window, that high desert wind that never really stops, can hear her considering whether to hang up or speak. "Nobody's asked about that in 20 years, she says finally. Her voice carries the weight of memories she's tried to bury, trauma inherited and personal. My father saw things that broke him. He was a practical man, raised cattle for 40 years before those months changed everything. Rosa describes her father's transformation after the mutilations, how he went from a confident, self-assured rancher to someone who checked the locks 3 times before bed, how he installed floodlights all around the property, turning night into something approximating day, the electricity bills becoming prohibitive but preferable to darkness. How he started sleeping with a loaded .30-06 rifle beside his bed, the safety off, his hand resting on the stock even in sleep. He would stand on the porch at night, Rosa continues, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, as if the phone line itself might be monitored. Just stand there for hours, watching the mesa, watching the sky. I'd wake up at 2, 3 in the morning, and he'd be out there in his robe, perfectly still, just watching. She tells Elias about the nights when the cattle would go silent. Not the normal quiet of sleeping animals, but an eerie, absolute silence that felt wrong on a cellular level. Her father would notice it immediately, would grab his rifle and his flashlight and go out into the fields, searching for whatever was spooking his herd. Sometimes he'd find nothing. The cattle would be standing motionless, awake but frozen, as if paralysed by fear or something else. Other times he'd find them the next morning, the mutilated ones, the ones that had been alive at evening check but were dead by dawn, their bodies altered in ways that denied explanation. He used to tell me, "They come at night, Micha. They come when the dogs won't bark." The dogs. Rosa's voice breaks slightly when she mentions them. Multiple ranchers reported the same phenomenon. Their dogs, normally aggressive protectors of livestock, would fall silent before mutilation events, not cowering or hiding, but simply standing still, as if their instinct to bark and defend had been switched off like a light. Rosa's own dog, a German shepherd named Lobo, who would bark at coyotes half a mile away, stood silent on the porch the night 7 more cattle were found mutilated in the south pasture. Just stood there, looking toward the mesa, body rigid, not making a sound. My father never recovered from those months, Rosa says. Even after the mutilation stopped, even after things went back to what everyone called normal, he was never the same. He'd wake up screaming sometimes, nightmares about things watching from above, about lights that moved with intention, about feeling helpless on his own land. She agrees to meet Elias, but only after making him promise he won't use her full name, won't identify the specific location of her ranch, won't include details that might make her family identifiable. There are still consequences, she suggests, for talking too openly about what happened in '79. Elias flies to Albuquerque and drives north, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to open country to the dramatic mesas and valleys of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. He meets Rosa at a truck stop diner in Dulce, a place where they can talk without being overheard, but where their meeting won't seem unusual or noteworthy. She's in her mid-50s, with her father's strong features and eyes that carry the wariness of someone who's learned that truth is often unwelcome. She brings a box of her father's papers, photographs of mutilated cattle, veterinary reports, insurance claim forms that were rejected, correspondence with law enforcement agencies that never led anywhere. The photographs are difficult to look at. Elias has seen crime scene photos before, has looked at images of violence and death as part of his journalism training, but these images are different. The precision of the mutilations, the absence of any evidence of struggle, the almost surgical quality of the alterations, all of it suggests something beyond human capability or animal predation. The FBI came, Rosa says, spreading documents across the diner table. Spring of '79, 2 agents, very professional, very thorough. They walked the fields, they examined the bodies, they took tissue samples, they interviewed my father for hours. She produces a copy of their report, obtained years later through an FOIA request. The language is careful, clinical, designed to document without concluding. But reading between the bureaucratic phrasing, Elias can see the agents' confusion. They can't explain what they're seeing. They can attribute the mutilations to neither human nor animal causes. They note the absence of evidence that should be present and the presence of evidence that shouldn't exist. They told my father they'd be in touch, Rosa continues. They said they were pursuing multiple lines of investigation across several states. Then nothing, no follow-up, no answers, like they documented everything and then just stopped. Elias asks if her father ever speculated about what was responsible. Rosa's expression darkens. He knew, she says quietly, or thought he did. Toward the end of his life, when he'd been drinking, he'd talk about it. About lights he saw moving low over the fields. About sounds he heard. Mechanical sounds that didn't match any aircraft or vehicle he knew. About feeling watched, not by people, but by something else. Something studying him like he was an experiment. She tells Elias her father became convinced the mutilations were connected to something operating out of Archuleta Mesa. He'd driven up there, hiked some of the accessible trails, talked to Apache elders who warned him away. They told him the mesa was bad land, that their people avoided it, that there were places where the earth felt wrong and the air tasted like metal. Before Rosa leaves, she places her hand on Elias's, the same gesture her father would use when he needed someone to really listen. My father died never knowing what happened to his cattle, she says, but he died believing it was real, that it was deliberate, and that whoever or whatever was responsible didn't care about him or his animals except as subjects. That helplessness, that knowledge that he couldn't protect what was his, that's what broke him. Not the financial loss, the powerlessness. Elias tracks down 3 researchers who met with Paul Benowitz in the early 80s, before his breakdown, when he was still coherent and methodical in his claims. Each lives in a different parts of the country now. Each left New Mexico decades ago. Each tells a similar story about a brilliant man who became increasingly unstable, though they disagree on whether his instability was organic or induced. The first is Leonard Stringfield, a former Air Force intelligence officer turned UFO researcher who met Benowitz in 1981. They talk via video call, Stringfield now in his late 70s, speaking from his home in Ohio. Paul was brilliant, Stringfield says, his face filling the screen, lined with age but his eyes still sharp. Absolutely brilliant. The first time I met him, he walked me through his data like he was presenting at a scientific conference. Frequency analysis, signal intercepts, directional triangulation. This wasn't some amateur with a radio scanner. This was professional grade work. Stringfield describes visiting Benowitz's home laboratory, seeing the equipment set up, the meticulous records. Benowitz had invested tens of thousands of dollars in radio monitoring equipment. He'd developed software for signal analysis years before such tools became common. He approached the mystery like an engineering problem to be solved. But something happened between 81 and 84, Stringfield continues, his expression troubled. Paul started making claims that went beyond what his data supported. He started talking about alien bases and genetic experiments. The methodical scientist became the paranoid theorist, and it happened fast. Too fast. The second researcher, Angela Morrison, is more direct in her assessment. She's a physicist who worked with Benowitz on consulting projects in the late 70s, before any of the UFO research began. "They broke him," she states flatly over the phone, her voice carrying absolute conviction. The Paul Benowitz I knew would never have descended into the paranoid ramblings he became known for without external pressure. Someone fed him disinformation systematically and deliberately. Morrison tells Elias about watching Benowitz change, how he became increasingly agitated, how he started seeing patterns that weren't there, how he began trusting sources that, in retrospect, were obviously feeding him false information designed to discredit everything he'd legitimately discovered. The Air Force admitted it later, Morrison says. They admitted running operations against Paul, but they framed it as protective, as trying to steer a civilian away from sensitive installations. That's not what it was. It was character assassination through psychological manipulation. The third researcher refuses to speak on record, but agrees to an off-the-record conversation. He's a former NSA analyst who worked signals intelligence in the Southwest during the early 80s. He won't confirm or deny specific operations, but he provides context that makes Elias's blood run cold. Paul Benowitz intercepted real signals, the analyst says. I can't tell you what they were or where they originated, but the response he received, the level of attention directed at him, that tells you everything you need to know. We don't run multi-year psychological operations against private citizens who've stumbled onto nothing. The analyst explains how these operations work, how you identify someone who's found something sensitive, then feed them a mixture of truth and fiction until they can no longer distinguish between them. How you encourage their most extreme theories while systematically discrediting them publicly. How you transform a credible witness into a cautionary tale. The goal isn't to silence them, the analyst explains. The goal is to make them silence themselves by destroying their own credibility. Paul Benowitz did more damage to his own claims than any government denial ever could, because by the end, everything he said sounded crazy, including the parts that were true. Elias's most disturbing interviews come from Navajo and Apache locals who've lived near Dulce for generations, whose connection to the land predates American sovereignty, predates Spanish colonization, predates the written history that treats this region as discovered when Europeans arrived. They speak carefully, as if the land itself might be listening, as if speaking too openly about certain things might draw attention better left avoided. Several refuse to speak at all. Others agree only to talk off record, their words documented in Elias's notebooks but not recorded, their names replaced with descriptions. Elderly man, former Apache tribal council, member, or woman, mid-60s traditional healer. Reed Soci is different. She agrees to speak on record, tells Elias to use her name, says she's too old to care about consequences anymore. She's 78, a grandmother and great-grandmother, with family roots in the region going back so many generations that the exact count has been lost to time. They meet at a diner in Dulce, the same one where Elias met Rosa. Marie arrives exactly on time, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body has been worn down by decades of hard living but whose mind remains sharp. She orders coffee. She doesn't drink and speaks in a voice barely above a whisper, forcing Elias to lean close to hear her over the ambient noise of the diner. My people have stories about Archuleta Mesa that go back centuries, she begins, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup for warmth despite the summer heat outside. We call it different names in Apache. The closest translation is the place where the earth breathes, or the place of deep voices. Marie explains that in traditional Apache cosmology, certain locations are considered powerful, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin. Archuleta Mesa is one of these places, but not in a benevolent sense. There are caves, she continues, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the diner walls, as if seeing the landscape in her mind. Tunnels that go deep. My grandfather told me stories his grandfather told him about warriors who went into those caves and came back changed. Some didn't come back at all. When Elias asks what changed means, Marie takes a long moment before answering. Their minds, she says finally. They would see things that weren't there or stop seeing things that were. They would speak in voices that didn't sound like themselves. They would know things they shouldn't know and forget things they should remember. We learned, over generations, to avoid those caves, to mark them as forbidden, to teach our children that some darkness is meant to remain unexplored. She slides a piece of paper across the table. On it are names and dates written in careful handwriting. 12 entries, spanning from 1982 to 2015. Missing people, Marie says quietly. Hikers, hunters, tourists, people who went into the area around Archuleta Mesa and never came out. The Forest Service says it's the terrain. The Bureau of Land Management says people get lost. They organise searches, use helicopters and dogs, and they find nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of where these people went. She tells Elias about her cousin, Benjamin Sosi, who worked search and rescue for 15 years. Benjamin was skilled at tracking, at reading the landscape, at finding people who didn't want to be found. He participated in searches for 6 of the names on Marie's list. He told me once, after he retired, that they were told to avoid certain areas during searches, Marie says, her voice dropping even lower. Grid coordinates marked off limits by federal authorities. No explanation given, just orders that certain zones were not to be entered by search teams, even if tracks or evidence pointed in those directions. Benjamin died in 2018, but before his death he told Marie something that still haunts her. He said on one search, in 2007, they found a camp, tent, supplies, equipment, fresh food, nothing disturbed, like the person had just stepped away. But there were no tracks leading from the camp, no signs of where they'd gone, just the camp, perfectly preserved, and no person. The missing person from that search, a 28-year-old geologist named Sarah Chen conducting soil surveys, was never found. Her family eventually held a memorial service without a body. The official conclusion was that she likely fell into a ravine or crevice, and her remains were unrecoverable. But Benjamin told Marie there were no ravines or crevices within 2 miles of that camp. The geology didn't support that explanation. It was as if Sarah Chen had simply ceased to exist mid-activity, leaving her belongings behind as the only evidence she'd been there at all. Before Marie leaves, she places her hand on Elias's. Her skin is warm despite the cold coffee cup she'd been holding, and her grip is surprisingly strong. They hear things under the ground, she says, her dark eyes holding his with an intensity that allows no room for dismissal. Machinery where no machinery should be. Voices that sound human but use words that make no sense. Lights in the caves that move with purpose. My people have heard these things for longer than the United States has existed. She stands, gathering her bag, preparing to leave. But she pauses, looking down at Elias with an expression that might be pity or might be resignation. The white people who came to this land, they didn't believe our warnings about the mesa. They thought we were primitive, superstitious. Then they went digging, and they found what we have always known was there. The difference is we respected it, avoided it, survived by keeping our distance. They tried to control it. That's the mistake that changes everything. Marie walks out of the diner into the bright New Mexico sunlight. Elias watches her go, his recorder still running, the list of names still on the table before him. 12 people, 12 disappearances. 12 families with questions that will never be answered, and beneath it all, under tons of rock and earth, machinery humming in places where no machinery should exist. Act 2. The government connection declassified hints. Elias spends 3 months buried in FOIA requests and declassified documents, transforming his apartment into something between a research archive and a conspiracy theorist's lair. His walls are covered with printouts, timelines, maps with pins connected by red string. His thesis. Advisor stops returning his emails. His funding situation becomes precarious. Friends start avoiding his calls. But he can't stop because what he's finding isn't smoking gun proof of underground alien bases, but something almost more disturbing, evidence of systematic misdirection and unexplained government activity concentrated around a single remote location with no obvious strategic value. The FOIA requests yield results slowly, each document arriving with heavy redactions, black bars obscuring names, dates, operational details. But even redacted, the documents tell a story. Air Force OSI memos from 1982, their headers stamped with classification levels that should have expired decades ago, discuss what they call Bennewitz activity and containment protocols. The language is bureaucratic but telling. They're not investigating whether Bennewitz's claims have merit. They're containing him, managing the problem he represents. One memo, dated September 1982, outlines a strategic disinformation campaign designed to redirect subjects' research focus toward non-sensitive areas while maintaining subjects' belief in primary hypothesis. In plain language, feed Bennewitz false information about aliens to distract him from whatever he'd actually found. But here's what keeps Elias awake at night. Why would a private citizen investigating radio signals require containment protocols? You don't deploy strategic disinformation campaigns against someone who's chasing nothing. You ignore them, or you politely correct them, or you send them a cease and desist letter if they're trespassing on secure frequencies. You don't wage psychological warfare against them unless they've found something real. NSA documents released in 2015, part of a broader transparency initiative that nobody paid much attention to, show surveillance orders for radio interception in the Dulce area between 1980 and 1984. The stated purpose is redacted. The target of the surveillance is redacted. The results of the surveillance are redacted. But the resource allocation is visible. Dedicated monitoring stations, specialized equipment, trained personnel assigned for 4 continuous years. Elias does the math. The cost of maintaining that level of surveillance in a remote area with minimal population would run into millions of dollars. For what? To monitor radio signals in the middle of nowhere? To watch a handful of ranchers and a small Apache community? The disproportion between resources expended and official explanation offered suggests something significant enough to warrant sustained, expensive attention. Then there are the FBI reports on the cattle mutilation phenomenon, obtained through multiple FOIA requests and cross-reference with state police records and veterinary reports. The documents span from 1975 through 1984, hundreds of pages documenting mutilation events across New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas and Montana. The reports are clinical, detailed, increasingly frustrated. FBI agents and forensic veterinarians document tissue samples showing thermal cutting effects, inconsistent with predation or known surgical tools. One report from a veterinary pathologist at New Mexico State University, dated April 1979, is particularly unsettling. The pathologist, a specialist in forensic animal medicine with 23 years of experience, describes examining a mutilated cow from the Gomez Ranch. He notes hemoglobin distribution patterns suggesting rapid exsanguination through unknown means, possibly vacuum extraction. The incision edges show cellular damage consistent with temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, but there's no burning or charring of surrounding tissue, as if the heat was impossibly focused, more precise than any cutting tool available to veterinary or surgical medicine at the time. The level of precision observed, the pathologist writes, exceeds the capabilities of even the most sophisticated surgical facilities. The absence of forensic evidence that should accompany either human perpetrators or animal predators suggests a methodology outside my professional experience and knowledge. A FBI summary report from 1980 attempts to draw conclusions from hundreds of documented cases. The report notes that despite extensive investigation, including laboratory analysis, field interviews, and consultation with medical and veterinary experts, no definitive explanation can be offered for the observed mutilation phenomena. The precision of the alterations and the absence of conventional forensic evidence preclude standard explanatory frameworks. Then, buried in a footnote, a single sentence that Elias highlights and photographs and stores in multiple locations. Tissue analysis conducted at Federal Facility Omega-7 indicates possible exposure to directed energy sources of unknown configuration. Federal Facility Omega-7, Elias searches every database he can access. The designation appears nowhere else in publicly available documents. It's a ghost reference, a hint of infrastructure that officially doesn't exist. But the psychological operations angle is what truly disturbs him, because it's documented, admitted, and still partially classified. Declassified documents confirm that from 1977 to 1981, Air Force intelligence ran active measures against Paul Benowitz under a program codenamed Desert Shepherd. They fed him false information about underground bases and alien technology. They created forged documents suggesting elaborate conspiracies. They encouraged his beliefs while systematically destroying his credibility. They monitored his mental health deterioration with the detached precision of scientists observing an experiment. One memo, written by an Air Force psychologist in 1983, assesses Benowitz's psychological state and recommends continued reinforcement of constructed narratives to maintain subjects' focus on non-operational areas. The memo notes that Benowitz is approaching critical psychological threshold, but recommends maintaining current operational tempo unless subject presents danger to himself or others. They knew they were destroying him. They documented his deterioration. They made calculated decisions about how far to push before his mental collapse might create unwanted attention. And they did it all in the service of protecting something near Dulce, New Mexico. Elias files FOIA requests for the files that remain classified, the documents that should have been automatically declassified decades ago under standard protocols. His requests are carefully worded, specific, citing exact statutes and precedents. He's learned the language of FOIA law, the magic phrases that theoretically compel disclosure. Each request comes back denied. The denials follow a template. The requested documents, if they exist, would contain information that could reasonably be expected to cause damage to national security if disclosed. The information remains properly classified under Executive Order 1295 and is exempt from disclosure under FOIA Exemption 1. But here's the thing that makes Elias's hands shake as he reads these denials. The exemption claims relate to ongoing operations and current intelligence activities. Ongoing operations, current activities. In reference to events from 40 plus years ago, in reference to a psychological operation against a man who died nearly 2 decades ago, in reference to cattle mutilations and UFO sightings that the official narrative dismisses as mass hysteria and mundane phenomena. If it's all nonsense, if there's nothing to hide, why are documents from the late 70s and early 80s still classified in 2021? What are they still protecting? Elias creates timelines, cross-referencing dates of mutilation events with dates of signal intercepts reported by Benowitz, with dates of unusual seismic activity recorded by USGS monitors, with dates of military exercises in the region. Patterns emerge that could be coincidence or could be something else. Spikes in mutilation reports correlate with increases in radio signal intercepts. Both correlate with unexplained seismic events that show rhythmic patterns inconsistent with natural earthquakes. All three phenomena cluster around Archuleta Mesa with statistical significance that resists random explanation. Something is happening in that location. something sustained, deliberate, and significant enough that the government devoted enormous resources to monitoring it, containing information about it, and destroying the credibility of anyone who got too close to understanding it. Elias compiles his findings into a timeline that stretches across his living room wall. 1967, first documented UFO sightings. 1975 through 79, cattle mutilation wave. 1980, Benowitz intercepts signals. 1980 through 84, government surveillance and psychological operations. 1995, Schneider gives Denver lecture. 1996, Schneider found dead. And beneath all of it, the constant presence of Archuleta Mesa, rising from the high desert like a monument to secrets the government has decided the public has no right to know. The anonymous contact. The encrypted message appears in Elias's inbox on a Tuesday morning in April 2022, arriving through an anonymous email service routed through servers in Iceland, Switzerland and Estonia. The sender's address is a string of random characters that will never be traceable. The message itself is brief, almost terse, written by someone who understands operational security and chooses every word with care. You're asking the right questions. You're looking in the wrong places. The base is real. Schneider was partially correct. Meet me. Instructions will follow if you're serious. Elias's first instinct is to delete it. This is how journalists get compromised, how careful researchers get led into traps, how people investigating sensitive topics end up discredited or worse. Anonymous contacts are the oldest trick in the information warfare playbook. Promise revelation, deliver misdirection, and document the target's gullibility for later exploitation. But something about the message's phrasing, its specificity about Schneider being partially correct rather than completely right or completely wrong, suggests someone with actual insider knowledge. Someone who knows the full picture and recognises that Schneider's account, while genuine in parts, was incomplete or misunderstood in others. Elias responds with a test. How do I know you're not trying to Benowitz me? The reply comes within an hour. Paul's mistake wasn't investigating the signals. His mistake was trusting people who claim to be helping him. I'm not claiming to help you. I'm offering information. What you do with it is your choice. They negotiate the terms through layers of encryption. The contact insists on a public place, broad daylight, multiple exit points, no recording devices, no witnesses. They settle on the Santa Fe rail yard district during the Saturday farmers market, crowds of tourists and locals providing both cover and safety. The contact provides a detailed protocol. Elias should arrive at 10 in the morning, buy a coffee from a specific vendor, then walk the perimeter of the market counterclockwise. Someone will approach him. They'll speak for exactly 20 minutes, then part ways. No subsequent contact will be possible through the email channel. Elias spends the week before the meeting running through every scenario, every possible trap. He tells a friend where he's going, leaves detailed notes, and a safe deposit box sets up a dead man's switch that will release his research if he doesn't check in within 48 hours. He's probably being paranoid, but paranoia and caution become indistinguishable when investigating subjects where people have actually died under mysterious circumstances. The Santa Fe rail yard on a Saturday morning is exactly what the contact promised. Crowded, public, impossible to control or monitor completely. Tourists browse artisan crafts. Families buy fresh produce. Musicians play for donations. It's aggressively normal, the kind of setting where clandestine meetings seem absurd. Elias buys his coffee and begins his counterclockwise circuit. He's halfway through his first lap when a man falls into step beside him, matching his pace exactly. The approach is so casual, so natural, that anyone watching would think they're friends who just ran into each other. The man is in his mid-60s, trim and precise in his movements, dressed in the kind of nondescript outdoor wear that's universal in New Mexico. His eyes are what catch Elias's attention, sharp, constantly scanning, taking in everything while appearing to focus on nothing. These are eyes trained by decades of operational awareness, by work that requires noticing threats before they develop. "Keep walking," the man says quietly. His voice is educated, with hints of East Coast upbringing softened by years in the Southwest. "Don't look at me directly. We're having a casual conversation. We're old acquaintances catching up." He introduces himself only as Robert, though everything about the introduction suggests this isn't his real name. It's a working name, chosen for this specific interaction, meaningless beyond this context. They walk through the market, weaving between stalls, Robert's eyes constantly tracking their surroundings. He identifies potential surveillance with subtle shifts of his gaze. A man in a parked car who's been sitting too long without buying anything. A woman with a camera who's taking pictures of people rather than produce, angles that could conceal directional microphones. "I worked at Sandia National Laboratories from 1976 to 2008. Robert begins, his voice low, but clear enough for Elias to hear over the market noise. "Materials Engineering Division. We did contract work for multiple agencies, DOE, DOD, projects I couldn't discuss even with my security clearance, projects that appeared on budget spreadsheets as line items without descriptions." He describes a career spent in the shadow world between acknowledged government programs and black budget operations that officially don't exist. Working on materials for projects he wasn't allowed to know the purpose of, shipping specialised components to locations he wasn't permitted to visit, signing non-disclosure agreements that turned his work into something he couldn't discuss with family or friends. "In 1983, I was part of a team designing composite materials for underground construction," Robert continues. They pause at a fruit stand examining apples while they talk. High-strength concrete with radiation-shielding properties, acoustic dampening systems for containing sound in subterranean environments, biological containment seals designed for laboratories working with hazardous materials. The specifications, he explains, were unusual. The materials needed to function at depths exceeding 1,000 feet, in environments with specific temperature and humidity parameters, with redundant containment systems suggesting work with exceptionally dangerous substances. The requisition orders were tagged with a facility designation. Unit Delta 5, Robert says. That designation appeared on internal logistics documents, shipping manifests, budget allocations. But when I tried to find information about what Unit Delta 5 was or where it was located, I hit walls. Classified, need to know, above your clearance level. He tells Elias about becoming curious, the way engineers become curious when specifications don't make sense, and projects seem to violate standard protocols. He started paying attention to patterns, shipments going to the same redacted location, materials ordered in quantities suggesting large-scale construction, timelines that implied ongoing operations rather than single projects. "The shipping addresses were always redacted in the documents I saw," Robert says. "They've moved to a quiet section of the market, ostensibly admiring handmade pottery." But requisition forms from the Geological Survey Division weren't as carefully scrubbed. They included topographical coordinates for delivery locations. Those coordinates pointed to an area near Dulce, New Mexico. Robert explains what he believes the Dulce facility actually is, and his explanation is more disturbing for its mundanity than any alien conspiracy theory would be. He describes a multi-level underground installation with compartmentalized purposes, where workers on different levels never interact, where each section operates in isolation without awareness of the full scope. Level 1 through 3, that's standard military research, Robert says, his voice taking on the quality of someone who's rehearsed this explanation in his mind countless times. Black budget projects, weapons development, classified material storage, nothing exotic by Department of Defense standards. You could find similar facilities in Nevada, Utah, New Mexico. Underground installations designed to survive nuclear war, to protect critical research, to operate independent of surface infrastructure. He pauses to buy a jar of local honey, the transaction giving them a moment to ensure no one is paying attention to their conversation. Level 4 is psychological operations, Robert continues as they walk. Information warfare, strategic deception, the kind of work the Air Force was doing when they ran operations against Benowitz. They study how information spreads, how to contain leaks, how to discredit sources without making martyrs of them. His voice drops lower, forcing Elias to lean in slightly to hear. Level 5 is listed in some documents as a genetic research facility. The specific phrasing in a 1983 budget allocation I saw was interspecies compatibility studies, not cross-species, not comparative genetics. Interspecies, which implies comparison between species that have some reason to need compatibility assessment. Elias feels his skepticism fighting with the meticulous detail Robert provides. This isn't wild speculation. This is someone reciting from memory documents he's spent years thinking about. Documents that haunt him enough that he's risking this meeting despite obvious personal cost. And level 6, Elias asks, his voice steadier than he feels. Robert's expression darkens, and for the first time his careful surveillance of their surroundings falters, as if the mention of level 6 pulls his attention inward. There are rumours, he says carefully. Personnel who worked the upper levels and heard things. Nightmare Hall, they called it. Supposed collaboration between human researchers and non-human entities working on genetic material exchange, hybrid development programs, compatibility testing for purposes no one would discuss. Before Elias can respond with the obvious objection, the reasonable dismissal of alien conspiracy theories, Robert pulls out a tablet computer from his bag. The motion is casual, as if he's just checking email or showing photos. But what appears on the screen is a document that makes Elias's breath catch. It's a geological survey map from 1968, stamped with Department of Interior seals and Bureau of Land Management authorization numbers. The document appears authentic, with a kind of degradation and period-appropriate formatting that's difficult to forge convincingly. It shows Archuleta Mesa and the surrounding area in topographical detail, but beneath the surface features notations indicating hollow chambers, multiple levels of them marked in blue ink with dimensional annotations. The chambers show clear geometric organisation, regular spacing connecting passages. Natural cave systems don't form in these patterns. These are engineered spaces, marked on a map 4 years before anyone outside classified circles was talking about underground bases at Dulce. This survey was commissioned in '68, Robert says, zooming in on specific sections. 4 years before Schneider's alleged firefight, 8 years before the cattle mutilations, 12 years before Benowitz started intercepting signals. They knew what was under that mesa before any of the conspiracy theories existed. He highlights a section showing a large central chamber with multiple levels extending downward. The annotations indicate depths exceeding 1,500 feet, with reinforced ceiling structures and what appear to be vertical access shafts. The survey was classified immediately after completion, Robert continues. I only saw it because a clerical error in the document control system at Sandia briefly made it accessible to my clearance level in 1987. When I tried to access it again 3 days later, it was gone from the system, but I remembered it. I've spent 35 years remembering it. He uploads the document to an encrypted drive and provides Elias with access codes. A string of characters Elias immediately commits to memory and writes in multiple secure locations. I'm telling you this because what's happening there, whatever it is, the public has a right to know, Robert says, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who's made a difficult ethical choice. But I'm also warning you, the people running this operation, they don't make mistakes. If you keep digging, they'll know, and they'll respond. Not necessarily with violence or obvious intimidation, but with something more sophisticated. They'll manage you, study you, turn you into data that helps them refine their containment protocols. Robert checks his watch, notes that they've been talking for exactly 18 minutes. In 2 minutes, he'll walk away, and this conversation will end. One more thing you should understand, he says as they make a final circuit past the vegetable stands. The psychological operation against Benowitz wasn't a failure. It was a wildly successful experiment. They learned how to destroy a credible witness without making him disappear, how to transform legitimate findings into conspiracy theories, by feeding the source false information until truth and fiction became inseparable in his mind. Every operation since has used those techniques. Benowitz was the prototype. Everyone who's investigated Dulcie since has been running variations of the same program. He stops walking, turns to face Elias directly for the first time. His eyes carry a weight of knowledge that seems almost burdensome. "They're going to do it to you," Robert says quietly. "They're probably already doing it. Every source you contact might be real, or might be feeding you disinformation. Every document you find might be authentic or might be planted. By the time you realise you can't trust your own research, you'll have discredited yourself so thoroughly that nothing you say will matter. That's the real genius of the system. They don't suppress the truth. They drown it in so much noise that no one can distinguish signal from static." Robert walks away through the farmers' market crowd, disappearing among the vendors and tourists, becoming just another figure browsing produce on a Saturday morning. Elias never sees him again. The email address stops working within an hour of their meeting. Every trace of their communication is wiped from servers that thought they kept permanent records. But Elias has the map. He has the coordinates. And he has a terrible certainty that everything Robert told him is true, which means everything that comes next is already anticipated, already planned for, already part of someone else's carefully designed response protocol. The question isn't whether he should stop. The question is whether continuing serves truth, or whether it makes him a willing participant in his own manipulation. He looks at the tablet, at the geological survey showing chambers that officially don't exist, and makes a choice that will define everything that follows. He's going to Dulcie. Act 3. The descent into Archuleta Mesa. Meeting the others. October 2022. Elias's research has consumed nearly a year of his life. His thesis advisor has stopped returning his emails. His graduate funding is running out. Everyone who cares about him thinks he's lost perspective, but he can't stop. He drives northeast from Albuquerque, watching the landscape shift from city sprawl to high desert to the imposing mesas of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. Dulcie sits in a valley, a small cluster of buildings dwarfed by the vast landscape and the looming presence of Archuleta Mesa. The town feels like it's watching him. Through local contacts, Elias arranges a meeting with Edmund Valdez, a former Jicarilla Apache tribal police officer who resigned abruptly in 1994 after 23 years of service. Edmund is now 71, living in a small house on the edge of Dulce proper. He invites Elias in with the wary hospitality of someone who's told his story before and not been believed. "You want to know about the night I stopped being a cop," Edmund says, pouring coffee with hands that still move with authority despite his age. "February 19th, 94. I responded to calls about earthquake sounds coming from under the mesa. Multiple witnesses, not tourists, locals, people who know the difference between thunder, drilling and something else." Edmund describes arriving at a trailhead near one of the old uranium mine entrances, long since officially sealed. The ground was vibrating. Not the rolling motion of an earthquake, but a steady rhythmic pulse, like massive machinery operating far below. "We had seismographs at the station. They registered nothing, no earthquake, but I felt it through my boots. We all did." He shows Elias photographs, taken with a film camera, of scorch marks in cave systems near the mesa. The patterns are unusual, radiating outward from central points in ways that don't match lightning strikes or campfires. Then Edmund produces audio files, transferred from old cassette tapes to digital format. He plays one. It's the sound of deep, rhythmic humming, so low it's almost subsonic. Elias feels it in his chest as much as hears it. Recorded in 2003 by a geological survey team, Edmund explains. They were doing environmental impact studies, found this in one of the accessible caves. Never released publicly. The team member who gave me this copy quit 6 months later. Wouldn't say why. But the most chilling evidence Edmund presents is a folder of missing person reports. Cases from 1981, 1989, 1992, all within a 15-mile radius of Archuleta Mesa, all officially unsolved. 2 were experienced hikers. One was a geologist, another was a journalist working on a story about land use conflicts on the reservation. The FBI came for 2 of these, Edmund says, tapping the folder. Took the files, the evidence logs, everything. Said it was part of a broader investigation. We never heard anything again. Families never got answers. Edmund walks Elias to the door as evening settles over Dulce. The mesa is a dark silhouette against the sunset. I spent 23 years keeping people safe, he says quietly. But there's a boundary out there, invisible but real. Inside that boundary I couldn't help anyone. Nobody could. After that night in '94, after feeling whatever was moving under that ground, I realised I was protecting people from the wrong things. He looks directly at Elias. They run the base, not us. Remember that if you go looking. Breaking into the tunnel system. Elias spends 3 days hiking the area around Archuleta Mesa, ostensibly documenting the landscape, actually mapping old mine entrances against Historical Bureau of Indian Affairs surveys from the 70s. He finds what he's looking for on the 4th day, a ventilation shaft, partially concealed by collapse and vegetation, that matches coordinates from a 1974 mining safety inspection report. The shaft is marked on old maps as sealed, but the seal is clearly compromised, broken from the inside based on how the concrete is fractured. He waits until after midnight. The moon is a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by without a flashlight. He's equipped with a small camera, a voice recorder, climbing gear, and a level of determination that overrides his better judgment. The shaft descends at a 40-degree angle. The walls show evidence of industrial drilling, clean and uniform. This wasn't natural cave formation. About 200 feet down, the shaft levels out into a horizontal tunnel. That's when Elias notices the air. It's moving. Not the stagnant air of a sealed mine, but a steady breeze coming from deeper in the complex. Conditioned air. Cool and filtered. He follows the airflow. The tunnel branches, connecting to what appears to be a much larger system. The walls here are reinforced with concrete and steel. There's infrastructure, ventilation ducts, electrical conduits, junction boxes with recent manufacture dates. This isn't abandoned, this is active. Elias moves deeper, his camera recording everything. The smell shifts, becoming chemical, antiseptic, like a hospital or a laboratory. The mechanical sounds grow louder, pumps, air handlers, something that sounds like generators in the distance. He reaches a junction where 3 tunnels converge. On the wall is a faded sign, military standard font. Unit D5, Joint Genetic Operations Center. Authorized personnel only biosafety level 4 protocols in effect. His hands shake as he photographs the sign. JGOC, Joint Genetic Operations Center. Robert's information was accurate. Then he hears voices. Footsteps echoing from one of the adjacent tunnels. Multiple people moving with purpose. Elias retreats, but the complex branches and he's disoriented. He takes a wrong turn and finds himself in a wider corridor with LED lighting and a large steel blast door. The door is marked D5 Primary Access. Security cameras rotate on mounts. Alarms begin to sound. Elias runs, adrenaline overriding thought. He crashes through the tunnel system, scraping against walls, his camera banging against his chest. He can hear pursuit behind him, coordinated and professional. He finds a side passage, squeezes through, emerges into what looks like a natural cave system. The sounds of pursuit fade. He climbs, finding another shaft, pulling himself up through darkness and panic until he emerges into cold night air. He doesn't stop running until he reaches his car, parked 3 miles away on a Forest Service road. He's violated federal property. He's documented classified infrastructure. He's crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The question now is what happens next. Act 4. The capture and the truth. Detained by unknown forces. Elias makes it 17 miles before the black SUVs force him off the road. It happens with professional efficiency. No sirens, no dramatic chase. Just 3 vehicles boxing him in on a remote stretch of highway near the Colorado border, their headlights turning night into day. Men in tactical gear, no insignia, weapons drawn but not pointed. They're calm, practiced. This isn't their first extraction. Step out of the vehicle, keep your hands visible. They search his car with systematic thoroughness. They find his camera, his notes, his laptop, his phone. Everything goes into evidence bags with alphanumeric designations. They find the GPS tracker he didn't know was attached to his undercarriage. "How long have you been following me?" Elias asks. No one answers. They transport him in a vehicle with blackout windows. He loses track of direction and time. When they finally stop and remove him, he's in an underground parking structure. Concrete, fluorescent lighting, the hum of ventilation systems. They take him to a room that's aggressively ordinary. Grey walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, a camera in the corner, its red light steady and unblinking. He sits there for 6 hours before anyone speaks to him. The 2 men who enter wear business casual clothing, the kind of nondescript professional attire that could belong to middle managers at any corporation. But their bearing is military. Intelligence. Community. They sit across from him, tablet computers in hand. "You entered a restricted federal facility," the first one says. No introduction, no badge. "You photographed classified infrastructure. You're facing charges under the Espionage Act." The Espionage Act. The same statute used against Snowden and Manning. Decades in federal prison. "I'm a journalist," Elias says, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm researching." "You're a graduate student with no press credentials investigating conspiracy theories," the second man interrupts. "You broke into a Department of Energy secure research facility. Your intentions are irrelevant. Your actions are prosecutable." They show him photographs on their tablets. Paul Benowitz in his workshop, looking gaunt and paranoid. Phil Schneider at that Denver lecture. 2 hikers who vanished in 2009, their faces smiling in photos that became missing person posters. Then a photograph of Elias himself climbing into the ventilation shaft. "You were in level 2, the first man says. "You saw signage for Unit Delta 5. You photographed infrastructure belonging to a joint operations centre. What you didn't see, what you couldn't have understood even if you had, is context." The second man leans forward. The facility under Archuleta Mesa is a collaborative research installation. It operates under joint oversight of the Department of Energy, the Air Force Directorate of Logistics, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Its work is classified, its very existence is classified, and people who compromise that classification face consequences. "Then charge me," Elias says. "Put me in front of a judge. Let me make my case public." They exchange a glance. Something passes between them, a decision made silently. "We're not going to charge you," the first man says. "You're going to be released." They let him go. The next 48 hours blur into a surreal nightmare of bureaucratic processing. They photograph him. They take his fingerprints. They have him sign documents he's not allowed to read completely, non-disclosure agreements with criminal penalties, waivers of rights he doesn't fully understand. They don't interrogate him about who he's talked to or what he knows. They don't seem concerned about his research. It's as if his entire investigation, everything he's done, is already known and already contained. On the morning of the 3rd day, they transport him again. This time, when the vehicle stops and the doors open, he's standing on a street corner in Santa Fe. Morning traffic, coffee shops, normalcy. His phone is gone. His camera is destroyed, handed back to him in a clear plastic bag, the memory card removed and the housing smashed. His car is nowhere to be found. and when he asks about it, the men simply point to a taxi waiting at the curb. "Your vehicle will be returned to your Los Angeles address within 2 weeks," one of them says. "Go home, resume your life, forget what you think you saw." They drive away, leaving him standing in the morning sun with nothing but the clothes on his back and a growing sense of unreality. He checks into a motel and tries to process what happened. They caught him in a restricted facility. They had every legal justification to prosecute him into oblivion. Instead, they released him with what amounts to a warning. Why? He searches his pockets, looking for his wallet, and finds something that wasn't there before. A small white card, unmarked except for a single line of text printed in black. "Stop digging. You were in level 2. There are 7 levels. He made it to level 2. What's below?" Act 5. The information wore the cover-up machine. Back in Los Angeles, Elias tries to rebuild his research from memory. He creates new anonymous accounts. He begins posting what he knows on conspiracy forums, Reddit threads, anywhere people might listen. The posts disappear within hours, not removed by moderators, not flagged by users, simply gone, as if they never existed. His accounts get shadow banned. His IP address gets blocked. When he tries to contact journalists who cover national security issues, his emails bounce back or go unanswered. He's being suppressed systematically and efficiently. Desperate, he begins analysing historical data. He looks at online discussion trends around dull space over the past 2 decades. What he finds is disturbing. Discussion spikes occur in 3 distinct periods: 1999, 2012, and 2020. He cross-references these spikes with other data. In 1999, FEMA conducted large-scale disaster response exercises across New Mexico. The exercises involved underground rescue scenarios and lasted 3 weeks. In 2012, residents near Dulce reported unusual air traffic, military helicopters, unmarked cargo planes. The activity lasted for 2 months, then stopped abruptly. In 2020, the USGS recorded a series of small seismic events under Archuleta Mesa. The events showed unusual patterns, rhythmic rather than random, consistent with underground excavation or construction. Each spike in public interest coincides with increased activity at or around the Dulce site. Each time, the discussion gets loud, then gets quiet. Information gets shared, then disappears. It's a pattern, a cycle, as if someone is deliberately allowing information to surface, then systematically removing it, studying how far it spreads and who pays attention. Elias realizes he's not uncovering a conspiracy. He's participating in a study. The entire phenomenon, the leaks, the suppression, the cycle of revelation and concealment, it's managed. It's controlled. The conspiracy isn't the base. The conspiracy is the information warfare around it. The final confession. The message from Robert arrives 6 weeks after Elias's return to Los Angeles. It comes through the same encrypted channels, but this time there's an urgency to it. "They know I've been talking to you. This is the last time. What I'm about to tell you is the truth, as far as I understand it. Whether you believe me is irrelevant. You deserve to know why they let you go." What follows is a narrative that Elias reads 3 times, each time hoping he's misunderstood. According to Robert, the Dulce facility wasn't built to experiment on anyone. It was built to facilitate an exchange. In 1954, the Eisenhower administration made contact with a non-human intelligence. This isn't speculation. This happened. The contact was managed through a series of intermediaries and resulted in an agreement. The terms of that agreement are above my clearance, but the implementation is not. Robert describes Dulce as one of several exchange facilities established in the late 50s and early 60s. The US provided access, infrastructure, and research collaboration. In return, they received technology and a guarantee of non-interference. The genetic research programs weren't about creating hybrids or conducting experiments. They were about compatibility studies, understanding biology different from ours. The exchange involved information, genetic material, research methodologies, both sides studying the other. Elias wants to dismiss this as insanity. But Robert's message continues with specific details that match too many pieces of his research. Paul Benowitz intercepted real signals. The Air Force destroyed him because he got too close to understanding the communication protocols. Phil Schneider was telling the truth about the firefight, but it wasn't an ambush. It was a containment breach. Security protocol failure. People died on both sides. Both sides. You stumbled into level 2, Robert's message continues. That's administrative and logistics. You saw the signage for joint genetic operations because that's where they process biological samples and conduct comparison studies. You didn't see level 5 or 6. Level 5 is where the actual exchange takes place. Level 6 is where they keep the agreements themselves, the contracts, the terms, the proof. Robert's final paragraph is a warning and an explanation. They let you go because you're not a threat. Your data, your investigation, your research patterns, your online behaviour, it all feeds into their analysis of information containment. They study how far someone can get, what they can find, how they respond to suppression. You think you were investigating them. They were studying you. And now that the study's complete, you're free to go about your life, knowing that anything you say will be dismissed as conspiracy theory, anything you prove will be deleted, and anyone you convince will be written off as delusional. The message ends with a single sentence. The truth isn't being hidden, it's being managed. Ending. The exit that isn't an exit, December 2022. Elias sits in his Los Angeles apartment, surrounded by the fragments of his investigation. His thesis is abandoned. His graduate funding is gone. His relationships are strained to breaking. But he has one thing left, the knowledge that he's right. The apartment has been searched. He knows this because small things are different. A book moved slightly, papers in a different order, the scratches around his door lock that weren't there before. His neighbours mention men in suits asking questions about him. Polite questions, official questions. He's being watched, assessed, catalogued. Elias makes a final decision. He uploads everything he can remember, everything he's reconstructed, to an encrypted site hosted in a country with strong digital privacy laws. He writes his testimony clearly and carefully, knowing it will be read by exactly 3 types of people. Those who already believe and need no convincing, those who will never believe regardless of evidence, and the analysts whose job is to monitor how this information spreads. His final words are chosen with precision. The dull space is real. I've seen it. I've walked its corridors. I've been detained and released by the people who run it. What's under level 6 isn't the problem, though I suspect it would reshape our understanding of reality. The real problem is how easily they made me stop talking about it. Not through threats, not through force, but through something more insidious. By making the truth indistinguishable from paranoia. By ensuring that anyone who speaks about this sounds exactly like someone who's lost their grip on reality. By creating a system where the evidence can exist in plain sight because nobody with credibility will touch it. They don't need to hide the truth anymore. They've made the truth hide itself. I know what I saw. I know what exists under Archuleta Mesa. And I know that by the time you read this, it won't matter. Because the mechanism designed to keep this secret isn't classification or suppression. It's something far more elegant. The certainty that anyone who talks about it will be dismissed as exactly what I sound like right now. There are 7 levels beneath the mesa. I made it to level 2. What's on the levels below is less important than the question of why we're not supposed to ask. What's being studied down there matters less than who agreed to let it be studied. What's being exchanged is secondary to the fact that an exchange is happening at all. They let me go because I'm not dangerous to them. I'm useful. Another data point, another case study in how far someone can dig before they're neutralised, not by violence or prosecution, but by the simple act of being made to sound crazy. So, here's my testimony. Believe it or dismiss it. Share it or forget it. Either way, underneath a mesa in New Mexico, there's a facility with 7 levels, and on those levels things are happening that we're not meant to understand. And the people who run it are counting on the fact that you'll never take this seriously enough to find out for yourself. Aloysius hits upload and watches the progress bar fill. His story joins thousands of others like it, indistinguishable from fiction, impossible to verify, easily dismissed. He closes his laptop and looks out at the Los Angeles skyline. Somewhere beneath the ground in New Mexico, machinery hums, research continues, agreements are honoured, and the world goes on, blissfully unaware or deliberately ignorant, he's no longer sure which. The truth isn't hidden, it's managed. And he's just become part of the management system, a cautionary tale about what happens when you dig too deep, packaged and presented in a way that ensures nobody else will make the same mistake. Elias Ford's investigation ends not with revelation, but with assimilation. He sought the truth. Instead, he became part of the mechanism that obscures it.